This video is brought to you by Barbell Apparel. If you are gluteally advantaged like I am, you might find it difficult to find comfortable clothing, let alone comfortable gear. And these stretchy jeans, these aren't jeggings, guys. You can wear these out to dinner and then go straight into a CrossFit workout without having to switch them out. You can do absolutely anything in them. They're comfortable, they're stylish, they're durable. Oh, and by the way, Barbell Apparel hosts a line of Bromley merch, so go ahead and check them out, support the channel. Now on to the show. We are very blessed to be joined with Mr. Sam Shether himself. You might know him as being an up-and-coming underground lifter on YouTube, documenting his training, giving more insight into training that honestly any of you deserve, and a very strong individual. Today he's put up an 880 deadlift, 600 bench, chasing a 400-pound strict press, which I understand he's very close. And I often reference him as the only person in the history of YouTube to ever do a road to video and actually complete it. And he's done so multiple times. So thank you, Sam, for joining us today. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me.
No, man, it's a pleasure. We've already talked a couple of times. I could talk to anybody for a substantial amount of time, mainly because I fill up the gaps with my own verbiosity, but you and I have gone for like hours and hours and hours. You're one of the few people who I think likes to talk about this stuff into the ground as much as I do, so I'm really excited to get into it today. I want to start off with the road to 400 press, because I've been following that, and especially as a bencher, I mean, you chased that 600-pound bench and nailed it, and now you're transitioning, and we've had this stupid discussion about does overhead press carry over to bench or whatever? So just tell us a bit about that journey, man. Like, what prompted it, and how are things turning out for you so far?
Yeah, I've always been a bit more of a gym lifter than a competitive lifter. I just liked getting stronger. For a while, I competed in powerlifting because it was just the sport that best described what I would be doing anyway. And I was kind of told online, like, it's a real shame to get strong and not compete. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. Like, I think you don't have to compete all the time. You don't have to define yourself as a competitive lifter, but just like I might give someone a hard time for never kind of going apples to apples with their comparisons, I still made an effort, like at least once a year, to compete. Then through college, I was just having a great time with my training. Things was going well. Didn't compete in anything. And by not competing in powerlifting, my training got slightly more general. I started including a little bit more emphasis on like vertical pressing power, varying like my squat types, doing some more front squatting, just kind of broadened out like the definition of the strength training that I enjoyed doing, because I guess at its core, that's what I like doing, is strength training. And at some point towards the end of college, I got an idea that, like, again, I'm just competing in the sport that's closest to what it is that I would be doing anyway, because I would give myself a hard time for not competing. So I throw my hat in the ring every now and then. And I realized that like Strongman probably fit slightly more to what it was that I liked doing than powerlifting did, because I value a 10 RM, I value a 5 RM, I value a 1 RM. And I like movement patterns outside just the big three. And at that point, though, I had just kind of my core metrics, though, where I think if you get super into I'm a general strength enjoyer, I'm not a power lifter, you can kind of fall victim to just constant moving of the goalpost and obscure where you're at, where it's like as soon as Zercher deadlifts start to get a little sticky, suddenly it's snatch grip deadlift time, and I don't actually have to confront the objective fact that I do not have my variables lined up in such a way that I'm getting better. So I really always was like scared. I really didn't want to do that. So I was like, okay, I do want to see my deadlift 1 RM, my bench 1 RM, my overhead press 1 RM, my squat 1 RM, maybe my front squat 1 RM, and then like a weighted chin up for reps. I want to see those progressing. Everything else can move around, but those are kind of my audit. And I had this idea of like maybe, and I, again, went a long time without competing. I did like one strongman comp, long time without competing, just because I was enjoying training so much. And I had this idea of like, well, what if I achieve like bottom end of world class lifts on my standards? Then maybe I can decide what it is that I want to do with the training that I've done. And I got the 600 bench was the first one. I'm like, all right, it's a gym bench. I'm more than happy to admit that, right? And I think that's the difference between, at least I like to think, between me and some other people, is like the fat pad does something. The not comp pause, it does something. People are like, why don't you just enter a contest? because it would have taken me another 6 months of really rigorous training to take that 600 and do a comp standard 600. That's my estimate. And that was a lot of work, and I was very tired of being that heavy, so I moved on to my next goal and counted my gym lift as good enough. In the lead up to my 880 deadlift, I did the 855 pull in a contest that moved pretty well. So I'm like, okay, well, that one strong, at least 2 strongman standards. Nothing too nefarious there. But I was like, if I'm checking off these lifts, like bottom end of world standard, but whatever the hell that means, right? And I had this idea of like 405. Even though there's plenty of world's competitors that are below that, they're more efficient with their leg drive. I was just like, 405 sounds nice. I should have kind of the base capability of building to that, having already reached the 600 bench press, especially as like a closer grip bencher. So that was kind of when I got it in my head.
The paradox there is like a big one that so many of us have to deal with, especially when they jump in and they start as competitors, of having this goal that you want to hit. So like powerlifting, it's the big 3, you know, and then everything you do is just always focused on those no matter what. And you get very myopic with it. Versus loosening up, having fun, being a gym lifter, doing other things, but then completely losing your ass as far as where you are in relation to anything that might make you better. And it feels like it's that arcade game where you have the steering wheel and you're trying to keep the ball on the winding path as it goes down towards a hole and it's going to fall off. It's either you're going to be too generalized and just end up doing a bunch of random shit, or what are you going to do? Bench 5 days a week, deadlift 4 days a week, with the same, rep range for the rest of your life. And it makes you want to blow your brains out. The thing that I'm interested in is how because it seems like, yeah, you've always wanted to get strong, but then you've also kind of oriented your training based on, I don't know, your preference at the moment. Like you enjoy training, so I'm going to do this, or I like these other lifts, so I'm going to focus on that versus being the best power lifter in the world. I'm kind of interested in how that impacted the outcome. Do you feel like there was just a really good boost you got from deciding to approach your training that way? Do you feel like you left anything behind by not just being like, I don't know, I'm going to run Chico for the rest of my life until I'm like an IPF champ? Like, how do you think the outcome is like tangibly impacted by those types of maneuvers?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing, right, is like I think the golden rule of self-coaching effectively is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Even if you come up with an entire thesis on why what you came up with would be superior, leave it the fuck alone. Especially if the rate of progression that you're enjoying right now is a desirable rate of progression. And like the longer you do, when you're like, ooh, I'm kind of in the pocket. Stay in the pocket as long as you can. Like, don't change it because you thought you came. Like, if you switch between 10 things that were all good too rapidly, you won't get the benefits of any of the 10. Even though individually, each of those 10 programs was a masterpiece, right? You might be bouncing between like a bunch of great programs you found some from very smart guys online, and just the act of changing throws you off. And the same thing could happen in like more minor scale of like if I'm shifting my secondary, even if I'm rapidly shifting my tier 3 exercises, like I think it can really throw off our trajectory. But we're like, oh, they're tier 3, it's no big deal. I'm self-coaching. I've got a feel for it, right? And it's like, well, are you progressing well? Are you zoomed out, predictably coming along? And I think there have been times where I leaned into that rule really effectively, and I don't think I was leaving much on the table at all, because I am very outcome oriented. Like I'm going to be bought into things that are working, and there have been times, like I would say, the reason my squat is not at the level my deadlift and my bench are is because I'm most guilty on that lift of maybe a little bit of goalpost moving, of adjusting my like approach more often than I have. I saw the most success early in my training career because I just kind of built myself a 10-week training cycle, adjusted the volume to my needs, and I ran that 10-week training cycle a bajillion times in a row for like 5 years straight. And most of the time I get like 5 to 10 pounds better on my bench press. And that took me from 315 to the mid 400s. And I was like, oh, it's still working. I'll keep going with like minor adjustments in volume, minor adjustments in frequency. It's still working. I'll keep going. And my willingness to leave the bench alone, I think, just as much as my leverage is part of why my bench excelled ahead. And then when I took a similar approach in my deadlift of just like, I need to see my +5 on this time interval that makes sense, based on a lot of zoomed out things, and I left it alone, it went quite well. I have not been as good about leaving my squat alone, but that's another goal for this year outside of the press is I would like to build my way towards 800 squat and sleeves. Again, just kind of looking at like general world's competitors type guys. A lot of them would struggle with that task, or some of them can do. A lot of them can do it. I'm like, okay, kind of bottom end of where that general proxy for leg power might want to be.
And one of the things I'm picking up on, like the more guys I talk to more frequently at the world level, especially in strongman, where there seems to be this benefit from spending all this time doing like other shit, athletic shit, building that base that like transfers over. Like both Mitch Hooper, like Luke Hatton said the same thing. He's like, I spent so much time doing other stuff that it was like GPP was so wide. By the time I got into lifting, it was like a straight shot to the top. Whereas starting out with lifting, it's like you have this long grind ahead of you when you're going from bottom barrel all the way up to the top. And it stands out to me that you do compete so infrequently, where there's like this model of competition where I think a lot of guys try to have almost competing be like part of their training, where it's like, oh, I'm going to do 15 contests this week on a Saturday, show up to most of them not peaked because you can't peak, and it's just going to have to work around my training. And then I think, Jesus Christ, like how does substantial work towards improving your press, your deadlift, and all the other things that need to be strong just to hang with all the other events, like how does that happen without burning yourself out? It seems to me that there's the kind of two sides of the same coin as far as you not competing, enjoying training, staying in the pocket. You get to milk that longer, whereas the actual competitive preparation phase of your life is going to come when you feel like you're there, and then it's going to be a run to something bigger.
Yeah, and I think there's pros and cons to each. Like if we're being realistic, I know you and I are both such big, like conceptually big on base building, that we're going to navigate towards the one that allots more time to base building. Lucas and his coach Alec have talked about this quite a bit, where like they call it the Canadian strongman problem, where they compete at a very high frequency, right? And what happens is they get very good at competing in strongman, which I can't understate, right? Like there are guys much weaker than me that I would lose to, because at this point in time, I'm not particularly good at strongman, right? There are, like, as you know, right? There's so many little tips and tricks that can make massive differences in event outcomes, especially like events where there's a lot more transitions, events where like, yeah, sure, throw us out for there for a max deadlift, and as long as you don't botch your attempt selection, it's going to shake out roughly the way it's going to shake out. But you look at like a loading medley, and it's like you can very much wily veteran your way into a lot of points over people that are objectively kind of stronger than you if we were to just like throw you on a dynamometer. And I think the high competition frequency, it does do that, right? And I think people talk about like the old school of like Big Z, JF Chrome, when they were coming up, would use lighter shows as training days. They would be an event day. Like that's their event day, is just doing shows. I think part of that isn't as viable now because the top shows are heavier than they were then. So this idea of like even a Giants live contest, as much people give them flack, that's not a training day. It's not a training day. Maybe for Mitch Hooper, it might fall into the classification of a training day, but for everybody else, that is a competition that you have to prepare for and then take some time to recover from. So I think that partially that's gotten less viable for top guys, but I think there's pros and cons. I think there's an alternate reality where if I competed a little bit more frequently, I probably could be 99% of as strong as I am right now, actually good at the sport of strongman. So like, I definitely don't want to make it out like I've got some high-minded reason for it. Honestly, it's just I'm enjoying the benefits of my bias, and I'm also reaping the negatives of my bias.
It's hard to settle on because I understand the point using it as training days. But I mean, the thing is, like, if you want to get good at loading medleys, doing 12 contests in a year is probably the worst way to do that because there might be the same loading medley in like 3 of them. And if you suck at them, like I did for years, and I still do if I don't prep for it correctly. It's the repetition and training that tends to build that up. And there's this weird wrinkle that happens when you're conceptualizing what happens in the amateur ranks up to the more competitive parts where they're trying to break through to the pros, up to the actual pro ranks of like worlds and the guys that show up at the Arnold. And I talked a bit about this with Austin Andrade and Nick Guardione, because like Nick just had that because he just won OSG in the Open, so he's experiencing that. Like I was the guy with the sandbag toss and the carries, and my deadlift is pretty good. But then he goes to Arnold, and I talked to him after that, and it's like, oh well, now all of these things are so much more important because you can see a lot of guys that are staples in the sport that are are kind of what you described. Like you can deadlift a lot if you don't botch your attempt, but this other stuff sucks. Where it's almost to the point, like once you crack into that upper echelon of strength, it's like you're good enough to be there where you're not getting, you're not losing your opportunity at Worlds because you are 3 seconds slower on a medley or whatever. I've seen you with a yoke. You're fast as shit with a yoke. You can deadlift and press a hell of a lot, but honestly, attention to those little details is probably going to serve you well longer anyways. But as far as the lighter shows go, it's like, for Z, I mean, even shows that aren't Giants Live, like you have to be Zydrunas or a top guy to treat those as training days anyway. So it's like, how do you even use that as a strategy for guys that are still at a 700 deadlift or, still struggle with a 300-pound bag? And the people that I think of, like I remember Ortmeyer competed all the time and got super dinged up. I think Novikov competed a fuck ton. And it's like Maxime, the Canadian strongman problem. Maxime just destroyed his bicep at the Arnold. So I don't know, man. My intuition tells me that you're in a really good spot right now where if you got trapped in competing, that's a lot of economy that's going to go towards other stuff that doesn't carry over to everything. But if you got a 600 bench and a 900 pull, it's like, okay, bridging the gap to that loading medley, that just got a lot smaller for you. So, not to glaze too much, but I think you're in a damn good spot for when you do decide to start competing seriously.
Well, I actually, I think it's what's the federation that you got into it with Bobby Thompson a little bit?
Oh God, Bobby Thompson's going to make another repost because I think I forgot it again. No, it was Clash on the Coast, and then it got taken over by Pruitt, and now it's PSL, Pro Strongman League.
So I'm doing
fast enough.
I get to do a little PSL contest. They're doing a 275 show down in Texas it's gonna, obviously there's no such thing as like a 264 whatever 120. There's no really like heavily established 120 kg 125 kg thing, and they want to put like a feeler out there for like who would actually do it. So it's gonna be a hodgepodge of like small open guys, big 105 guys. As I hear, Kevin Ferris is going to do it. A couple of like really good 105 guys are going to do it. Somehow, despite not doing anything, I get to go. And it'll be interesting it's going to be a good reality check, like how far off in certain aspects I am, people that are very high level competitors, because I am hell bent on not being the moron that overestimates where I am in relation. I've always thought it was better to assume you're further away from the goal. Like people would always give me a hard time on my road to 600. I'm like, hey guys, it's gonna be 6 more months. And then it happened 2 months later and like, see, you were wrong. I was like, I'm not gonna lie to you. I had some ideation that I was pretty close, but I always if I've got a range, I'm gonna say long end of the range. That way, at best, I'm surprised. At worst, I'm right. So it's like if I go and I'm like, oh man, maybe I'm only a year of more specific work off of being decent, right? I'm not going to be Mitch Hooper. I'm not going to break onto the scene and destroy everybody. I'm some 5'10", 260-pound dude. Like there's some specs there that make some events a little bit difficult, but be a guy, be someone that's decent. And maybe I show up and I'm like, oh wow. Man, these heavy sandbags aren't just this parlor trick. There's a lot of physical qualities that take a lot, because skills can be developed quickly. Physical qualities take a while. Maybe there's more physical qualities between me and that than I thought. And maybe this is about 3 years away. And thankfully I'm young. So I'm optimistic regardless, but I'm actually having to put my road to 405 on pause because I would like to not make a fool of myself at that contest. And I don't think that strict pressing the day away is the best way to get good at strongman.
What's the overhead for that meet?
I believe it is a logged ladder. So I think it's like 340 for 2 and then a 380 for 2 for time.
Huh. So some of these event selections make me scratch my head. I don't know why you don't just have it's like, is that better to watch? Does that test something specific? They do weird mix and matches with different reps on different implements. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole.
I'm just glad it's not a self-load. Anything that's not a self-load, I'm happy camper.
Self-load, I know. Good God.
I'm actually going to
keep it to the basics, but I mean, as far as like, I mean, again, the strict press is the base. Have you put in a lot of time to push pressing? I know you were Viper pressing logs for a while. Like you did a insane Viper press with the log. But like how do you feel that transfer with your leg drive?
So I'm actually going to be, because I really, really don't want to make a fool of myself at the first non-local level contest I do. So I'm actually going to hire Alec Jose Lucas's coach just to make sure, like, I trust the system. I've known Lucas since he was a very not that great super heavyweight powerlifter that wasn't taking it seriously. And we trained at the same gym. I was like, I'm whooping that guy's ass. And I have watched him absolutely eclipse me. So I've got some buy into the system. I do personally think Alec is the best coach in Strongman. That's just my observations from watching as a fan. So there's some inherent buy-in there, and I also think it fills in some of the things that I need the most work on, where it's like Alec isn't huge on emphasizing the deadlift in the off-season. Fine, that's probably one of my stronger events. He doesn't bench press. Fine, I'm pretty good at that. Huge emphasis on overhead with leg drive, really doesn't care about strict. Fine. And I need more work on that than I do on strict press. There's people that are crushing me on overhead events that can't strict press within like 50 to 70 pounds of what I can. So it feels like, I always think that's like an underrated thing, is it's not just good coach, bad coach. It's like this coach's specialties. Do they fill in your weaknesses, right? Like Thor was famous for always doing well on moving and odd object events, but wasn't quite statically where he needed to be. Powerlifting coach was a phenomenal fit because it filled in the one thing that he was bad at, just getting that gym strength off of the squat and deadlift. And there's something that's something that Sebastian Orep is very, very intimately familiar with, is like the technique and recovery curves of exotically strong lifters. We start getting to that Lilly Bridge method. 1 week is heavy squat, 1 week is heavy deadlift, which you see a lot of guys gravitate to when they are these 1,000-pound pull, 900 plus squat type guys. There's enough overlap in musculature used. The recovery curve maybe spans past 7 days, so they need to be offset. And it ended up being a really good fit. I think I've got the physical parameters of a good push presser. I've got strong legs. I can jump really, really high. I've always been able to jump really, really high. I've got a big strict press, and my overhead mobility at least for my strict shoulder strength is still pretty good. My front rack is hellacious, but so is almost everyone's in open strongman. So I can at least be like, okay, it's okay. I'm not bad. I'm average, right? But like my overhead mobility has stayed quite loyal. I'm very, very diligent about, like, me and my brother have done mobility every night before bed for the last 10 years. It's just kind of been part of our approach to training. So I've preserved a lot of that overhead mobility. But man, my over leg drive is not synced up. Like every now and then I'll get a rep right. And Alex's whole thing is like the overhead with leg drive is like a parlor trick. If you have the timing right and the ability to position your hips in space correctly, it just happens. You don't need to be outstandingly strong in the upper body. You don't even need to have the biggest squat. But if you're really good at that parlor trick, you can get a lot of weight over your head. And I'm not so good at that parlor trick, so I figured that would be a good pairing.
That's been my experience. I mean, once upon a time, my push press was really good. I mean, I had periods where it would lead my strict press by like 100 pounds. And then as I would get my strict press better, that gap would close, but my push press would still get better. But the amount that you can transfer from the leg drive through just to get it moving, and then even by the time the momentum's kind of given out, your ability to carry that through with your upper body, it is kind of insane. It's way more than you would really expect. I always go back to the Klokov video. He had like a 496 push press that just, it doesn't make sense how quick it goes off. And he's got the bouncy rubbers on the end, and that adds to it a little bit. But I mean, I think he had like a sub 400 pounds. I think he had like a 375 strict press, but going into that push press, it does just show just the speed and the timing. And I've always treated it as a compound lift by itself, and that always served me very well instead of, I'm going to do this other shit and then go try to push press. And then the beauty is you got a log, so that's like, I mean, it's like a board press for your shoulders. So I have a feeling you're going to be very comfortable with those implements.
It'll take me a sec. I was doing some log for the first time in the wild the other day, and I'm like, ooh, wow, I need to really lock in with my T-spine mobility to be able to get a good dip and drive without my hips sliding forward. I don't know. I always thought that was one of your really, really strong talking points, was like the push press being the base, so to speak. Because I think if you look at athletes that use the strict press as the base, They always are going to have really junky knees because it's like, yeah, we're using our lower body in a way that's kind of unique, right? It's almost more plyometric in nature versus the squatting, which is more of a static lift, right? We are actively using a stretch reflex out of our tendons. And it's like tendinous adaptations are specific. So if we never jump or push press, why would we expect to have good elastic qualities in our knees? And if we don't have good elastic qualities in our knees, why the fuck would we expect to do a really heavy push press and expect them to not hurt? So it's like, I think that and you can see the other implications of the guys that really bias their training towards strict press heavy. They're all terrible at circus dumbbell because intuitively our body's really good at using what we think is strong, right? Like it's like the argument against having the strongest biceps because it seems like the guys with the strongest biceps are the first ones to tear them because they stumble with a bag and intuitively they're like, my biceps are strong as shit. Let me catch it with my biceps. Whereas if you don't have strong biceps, your intuition would never ever be to try to pick it up with your biceps, right? Like you see someone like a Gen Pop person with really weak upper body. Guess what they don't do? They never bend their elbows when they're deadlifting. They really intuitively understand leaving the arms long like ropes because they've got some confidence in their lower body and none in their upper body. So intuitively, you never have to teach them flex the tricep. It's only the big guys who've done a bunch of rows that will bend their elbows to crack it off the floor because they've got so much subconscious confidence in it. And I think the second you start thinking as a circus dumbbell as an overhead lift or as an upper body lift, you're going to be a terrible circus dumbeller unless you're a big Z and you're so strong that you can do a low velocity 300-pound circus dumbbell. But major exception, not the rule in any way. Everyone else that intuits it as a shoulder press with some leg drive ends up quite poor. You see people with these monstrous strict power, Bobby Thompson being a quintessential example, potentially. Andrea Thompson being a great example of someone with insane shoulder power and then almost coming back to bite her because she tries to take over doing the work. Whereas you get a Novikov or a Matoush out there, a lot of the Eastern European guys, Novikov's training partner, I'm blanking on his name, pretty spindly arms, is not going to try to press that thing out. He'll bend to the side to get under it. Whether you do a push jerk like Sam Beliveau or you bend like Novikov and Matoush do, you got to get under it because you're not pressing. You have no chance of pressing that out. So I guess observationally as a fan, I've seen the downsides to just being the strict guy. So that was big part of my decision. But yeah, I'm hopeful because, like I said, I think the physical parameters are right. I'm short. I got short arms. I'm pretty quick.
I think I'm thinking of the same guy, Mateus's training partner, that doesn't look like much physically through the upper body and can just crank his arm, fold it in half like a piece of paper to where the dumbbell's entirely resting on his body. And speaking of parlor tricks, if you do it right, you're jumping a weight, and it's a weight you could probably jump, close to almost over your head. And then if you're good at the catch, either by getting under it or pushing yourself away from it, very little upper body work even goes into it. And that's where you objectively handle the biggest weights. And I struggled with that for a long time, similarly, because I want to stay very upright and I want to jump straight up. And I look at someone like Camby was good at it, pushing himself away. And I'm like, my obliques don't work that way. And then it's like, Jesus Christ, am I going to throw something out doing it? And I had to go back and learn that technique. And it's true. Putting it in your perceived strongest position is only good if you developed your strongest positions in accordance with that lift. And we can think of extreme examples. I was talking to some guys about the way Trey Mitchell, the way he laps a log, he rows it into his body. Yeah. Trey has a buddy of mine, Nick Romero, out from House of Power in California, was the first one to point this out. He's like, Trey's lat insertions are so freakishly high. They come in like a transformer, and then there's his waist. And he's like, I think that has something to do with why he's such a good raw stone loader. And I brought that up to somebody, and they were like, well, that kind of makes sense. Have you seen him row a 450 log into his lap or whatever? And you think of other examples, you think of the heavyweight Olympic lifters that, you're not supposed to do an upright row when you're trying to execute a clean and jerk at the Olympics, but there's guys where if you freeze, the bar's not even at their knees and they're already starting to pull with their arms because, I guess you're a 380-pound Olympic weightlifter that, maybe that feels like the strongest, but it's objectively costing you power.
Yeah, Z always used to do the row to the lap position as well. And I copied that. My first time I did log, I was always a row to the lap type of guy. And like if you're doing a log for reps, it's submaximal, wastes a little bit of energy, but like that might not even shake out to an extra rep. But like a log for maximum, that's just burning a needless amount of energy doing a harder exercise to get the implement off the floor. So that was something I changed really quick when I talked to people that knew what they were doing, and they're all like, no, there's guys who have gotten away. Like that's kind of the argument that like Lucas has always made, which is like people go, well, yeah, but the biggest log presser was Big Z, and he's upper body, like kind of upper body dominant as a presser. And so, well, first of all, Big Z had a double patellar rupture before his first World's Strongest Man win. And he might have had a more lower body dominant, a little bit more dynamic press. He probably could have log pressed like 550 had he been a little bit more confident in a dip and drive, but you can't blame him for not after both of your patellas pop off on it was like a Conan's wheel in like Finland or something. And so it's like, okay, a lot of his training decisions should be viewed through that lens as someone who's accomplished a lot after a catastrophic, very much like career-ending type injury. If a double patellar isn't a career ender, I don't know what is. And so it's like, oh, well, Big Z didn't have any forward knee travel in his squat. It was very hip dominant. And it's like, well, watch his old IPF tapes. It was a little bit more of a standard squat. The stance only went comically wide when he started being a little bit more hesitant to like really heavily load the quads. The same thing with like the overhead. He was just so big and strong, he got away with it. But like you said, if you're going to gravitate to your areas of strength, not all areas of strength have the same ceiling. In the short term, if you got a really strong upper body, doing as much work on your deadlift with your upper body is going to how you lift the most weight. But in the long term, you might have a ceiling versus the guy who has like a little bit more of a lower body dominant deadlift. The guy who's doing a lot of work, rowing it off the floor, his elbows are super bent. You can see he's just getting a lot of work done with the upper body. I'd argue that the ceiling is a little bit lower, and the same thing for overhead. And that's always been Lucas's point. He's like, yeah, in the short term, there's some guys that are a little bit slower, more of a strict pressy style. In the short term will work better for them. And if they've got injuries, fine. But if they took a year to relearn and strengthen their lower body into a lower body dominant press, that ceiling is higher. And I think that's kind of coming to fruition where if you look at on the men's and the women's side, the best overhead athlete in women's strongwomen is Inez. And I would argue at this point, Lucas is the best overhead athlete in strongman. Both of whom are very firm believers in lower body dominant pressing. Their training obviously has to reflect that to potentiate it, but not all the ceilings are equal. Like coming from a powerlifting background, I can see this where it's like, yeah, there's certain techniques that in short term, if you lean into your strengths, they're going to get you that PR 2 months from now, but you're going to be batting up against a ceiling. And if you took that step back to lean into a more traditional technical model, that might free you up a year from now for more continued progression.
Ever find yourself confused by the complexity of programming? I know I struggled like crazy in my early strongman career. There was just too much advice, and every decision I made felt like a guess. As soon as I hit a snag in any program, I would have no idea what to do, so I would inevitably bail. It took me years of training and coaching to figure out how to predictably increase muscle and strength, both in myself and others. And those lessons took me to my own showings in World's Strongest Man, America's Strongest Man, and the Arnold in the 231-pound weight class. This is why we made Base Strength AI, to give clear, direct, and personalized instruction right in the middle of your workout in real time. Base Strength AI features 3 programs: Block, 70s Powerlifter, and Bull Mastiff, each one inspired by the work ethic and programming of the biggest and strongest bodybuilders, powerlifters, and strongmen throughout history. These templates originated in my book Base Strength, and they can be ran as is, but with Base Strength AI, weight and volume are prescribed to you on your specific feedback, and that's personalization that even an online coach can't replicate. This gives you the absolute certainty that every rep is meaningful, that every block of training is getting you closer to your goals. It's my programming, but it's your program. Get the heart of old school training with the intelligence of a coach right in your back pocket. Head now to basestrength.com. The trend I saw early on, and I'm not as close to the amateur ranks over the last couple of years to know if that trend has changed a lot.
Good.
But because so many people have they start off obviously relatively weaker. They don't wait till they're 400-pound pressers to go into contest. So you get people that are starting relatively, in the novice ranks and so on. They're like, well, how do I become the best presser? And it's very often jumping straight into a hyper athletic, dynamic lower body overhead press setup, which is essentially a split jerk. And especially when CrossFit, there was a time where CrossFit was feeding a ton of people into the amateur ranks of strongman, and you would see these guys come in looking like nothing and just run roughshod over everybody because they were competent in a jerk. And, we're beating the local strong guys that thought, because they could bench, 500 pounds, that they could do something, which was kind of funny to watch. But then that in and of itself, it's like the other edge of the sword where the whole sport, the problem with it is trying to, what qualities you need, but it's trying to figure out what proportion, what carries over to what, and on what timeline do I need to develop what. And that's where all the complexity comes in. Then you add in like individual predisposition and it becomes a clusterfuck. But there were just a lot of people going straight to the jerk, especially in the women who have less of a capacity to quickly kind of develop a relatively strong upper body. And then it's like, okay, now you have this skill. It's like, okay, now you have to make people do shit they don't want to do, which is go in and strict press and do accessory work and bodybuilding type stuff. And it's interesting when you look at like Inez and Lucas, who, they're both obviously competent in the jerk, given the big jerk at the Arnold a couple weeks ago. However, they both they both fall short of what you would see in the best female Olympic lifters and male Olympic lifters in the heavyweights as far as a jerk goes. Obviously, because they didn't spend the last 10 years focusing just on that. So it still goes back to this. Close. What'd she do, a 375 or some shit?
Yeah.
I think I want to say the best female clean and jerk is like a 430 or something.
I want to say a little lower. Whatever. I'm not going to pretend I know. Yeah. Ignore me.
It's low 400 pounds. I don't know if it's cracked into the mid. Low 400 pounds. But still, yeah, she's getting close. She's not. When you're at the point where you throw quarters on and it's a world record, like okay, but it still hints at the fact that it's like the jerk is still the most optimized thing you can do, but it's strongman, so it has to be balanced with these other qualities. And the question is, how much juice do you give to each one? And it's like you can almost come up with any heuristic you want. It's going to have some truth to it, and you can build up a system because there's so much variability for the people. And that's something I've always struggled with, having been good at it. And it's like, okay, if I'm coaching other people, it's like, well, you're not going to have the same qualities I did. What's the best way to onboard people? Where you're much less likely to get somebody like, I always cite Jesse Nelson in the 105s, who could do like a standing incline bench press. It reminded me what it was like Steve Reeves or John Grimmick back in like the 30s or 40s. There's a video of them doing like a deep, like backward bent press with like 365 or something. But that's kind of what he would do. And he did I want to say he did like a 415 or something like that. And he would press his logs the same way. And it's like, even that is the pinnacle of what you could potentially do. But that guy still isn't going to be suited running his events like that, because of the energy expenditure, because of the wear, and because of how absolutely freakishly good you have to be for that to even be viable. It doesn't even make sense. But I think the juggling aspect. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I think, one of the things I think it's been proven at this point by multiple guys that really layback heavy press, where you push press into a catch with a layaway, can be taken to a really high level, right? Like everybody's talking about Machupa right now, but Matouche always used the same technical model of create height with your legs and then get behind it so you can get your pecs into it, get into a stronger plane of pressing to finish the press. And part of the reason I've navigated away from that, even though I think I could be quite good at it, my low back is very durable. I never really have heard it before. And I've benched 600. So on paper, I'm kind of the candidate to lean into that kind of technical model. I think there's just an inevitable fatigue management issue where it's like, yeah, we can get all barbell medicine and say, like, if you are diligent enough, maybe you can develop tolerance to those positions. I don't doubt it. But if then I have to turn around and do a max Atlas stone and also a 10 RM deadlift in the same show, we can say there's no bad positions, it's all fatigue management. Well, that's a fucking fatigue management nightmare. So if I can bias the fatigue I get from overhead events into kind of my knees, my quads, and a pure kind of shoulder and tricep endeavor, that's going to interfere with other events in the show a lot less. And that was when I was kind of exploring that technique. I do think it's pretty viable, especially if you do kind of check those parameters of high shoulder strength, high durability in the lower back. It's proven to be a viable technique, right? You can go as low as you say, the lighter of it guys get away with less because they have to be more efficient. Nadia Stowers is doing it at the highest possible level. It can be done. But I do think it's like you do walk a really fun, and like Matouche always lost points on his deadlift. Why? Because he had a bad back. Could that bad back have something to do with every time he would do an over event, it was going to add a lot of fatigue to that cup? You could certainly argue it might, like, I don't think that would be a crazy argument to make.
Well, I also think about how it puts stress on your anterior chain. I'm reminded of this reaction video I did to some kid. God, I forget his name. I wish I'd give him a shout out. But it was a kind of it was a kid that looked like he was in his trailer, overweight, wearing his Walmart clothes, looks like he hadn't showered in a week, and he's doing his favorite odd lifts with makeshift stuff, which was,
I know the
you
kid.
know who I'm talking about.
I know exactly.
Yeah.
The lean back, the guy doing the reverse RPE.
The reverse deadlift, or is a reverse stiff leg deadlift. So it's like a hack squat where the bar's behind your back and you're doing a deadlift, but he was doing it stiff leg, which means you can't squat. Well, what is that? What does that look like? And the funny thing is, I have so many like strong hot takes that like make me mad, make my face even redder. But that means I end up putting my foot in my mouth quite a bit. This is one of those where I almost have to do that because I'm like, what in God's name is the purpose of that? Other than you saw that it is different and new and hard and weird, and it did what you thought it did and got a lot of attention. And then you start thinking, what do we do that really strengthens the anterior chain a lot with all the work we do for the posterior chain? And I'm thinking about this because I suck leaning back. I cannot extend back when you see the small guys get to like a 60-inch platform because they can pull it up and then lean back and I can't do that. And when I do stone or bag to shoulder, I have a big problem where if I start to lean back, I go cross-eyed, I start to pass out. I'm not strong in that position. My body's like, what the fuck are we doing? And I'm starting to think about that lean back position. I'm like, that's probably a pretty viable accessory exercise to get used to that, aside from actually leaning back with blocks and bags and kegs and whatever.
I've been using GHD sit-ups, but a little bit more the CrossFitter style, where instead of just going to parallel, because I've always been a big believer in GHD sit-ups. I just kind of took them from Dan Green. I just saw doesn't do a lot of lower body assistance work, but always did those. So I was like, there's a reason for that. I think his system is pretty coherent. The things fit together pretty well to create, like, honestly, underly specific in powerlifting. He's been out-totaled since by guys that are probably a little bit less generally strong. But I think the things fit together into like a holistic strength system very well. So if he's doing something for a long time, I'm very curious as to why. And it's like you said, there's not really it's kind of a compound to load that anterior chain. And unlike a lot of ab exercises, you don't outgrow it. Where it's like you can get good enough at planks where unless you have a really strong training partner to put a big ass bag on your back or you're doing really long time intervals, you can kind of outgrow them. Most ab machines, you don't have to be the strongest guy of all time to stack them with some added weight with a gym pin. There's some things I think that if you do really diligently stick to it, you can kind of run into like practical issues like a cable crunch. Most strong guys can do a weight that would pick them up off the ground. So it's like, where are our infinitely progressible exercises? Well, a GHD sit-up with a weight behind the head, I don't know a soul that has outgrown those. So that's kind of been something I've kept in the background. And you can go to like parallel to kind of keep more of a bracing mechanic where you don't open at the rib cage and practice that anti-extension. But then I've also started including some lighter sets where I go past and I go into extension and display control of that extended position. Because as a shorter guy, not having extension is the death of every loading event because they're going to make you load to a high-ass platform. You're not Tom Stoltman. You're not, especially like Hafthor. Hafthor never does a full extension with the stone. He sits on his gut and just stands up as a front squat, but he never trains a full extension, which is why like everybody's like Thor is going to be in the running for the stone shoulder at the Arnold. No, he's not, because he never trains full extension. He never rolls it all the way up. Like Martins would always do the reps. We'd roll all the way up to his chest and then pause. And that would be his default mode of training in the offseason is a full extension. And then maybe he would sign up for a contest and the height is a little lower. It's awesome. I only have to do the first half. I can ratchet up the weights. It's like there are a lot of guys in American Strongman do some goofy stuff where they'll train like, why are you training a really easy deadlift variation in the offseason? I'd rather pick a hard variation, get the events for my next show, and be yippee-ki-yay, I get to add 200 pounds, than to do the reverse. Like, why are we doing these, like, if you're great at elevated pulls, why are you doing nothing but 18-inch deadlifts or, like, things that make you feel strong? Then you sign up for the contest, you're like, oh, wow, it's an axle standing on a mat. I have to start from scratch. I would like to start, like, I kind of default to the stiff bar because it's like, if my stiff bar is good, I can kind of get in shape for anything with an elevated height. I can get in shape for an axle. It's hard enough that it's not this jarring transition to anything that might be a deadlift event, because every show is going to have something that looks like a deadlift for the most part, and it makes for like a smooth transition. So when I think loading in the off season, I would like to load with a full extension, and loss of that full extension is something that, like, especially the shorter guy, I kind of got to fix. And I was having an issue where I'm pretty comfortable in extension, but for whatever reason, I don't know if it was just from like pushing for the 880 deadlift, I lost a lot of my thoracic extension. So I was getting too much of that extension coming from my lumbar, and that led to some like fatigue management issues. And so I've had to kind of really work every night to hash that out to where it's like, if I can distribute that extension across my whole spine a little bit better, I can regain access. I know StrongerMan, his obsession with strict log, part of it is he thinks you can get a lot of volume in on it and just build volume, like very Bromley adjacent base building, build a lot of work, voluminous training. But he always said part of the reason, though, is he doesn't want his guys to lose access to extension, and he doesn't want them to lose tolerance. Because even if you can access it, if you're very extension intolerant, and the second you kind of go towards extension, you get back pain. When you start up a prep that involves extension on a weekly basis or on a bi-weekly basis, you're cooked. You're constantly in pain. So you need to have something maybe in the off season to develop long-term tolerance with a progressive load. Like you said, with like the reverse, I'm like, maybe there's something to this of a grade, like maybe we do need some graded exposure, because on some level it's a sport specific position.
And that's connecting like all of these dots to like giant holes in my game, because as I said, like I can't do that extension, and then it's like, well, gee, when I'm doing a prep where I have to do a what my 90% deadlift is in an AMRAP, and I have to do that while also do a loading medley to a high platform, and also do a log clean and press and all of that. Like, gee, why does my back hurt? Why am I getting overuse issues? And then when I think of my my thoracic extension, my ability to actually stabilize while I lean back and actually get that movement, if it sucks, yeah, that's all going to go into my back, and then it compounds with everything else. And it's like, okay, things like GHD sit-ups, I mean, that sounds like a great exercise, and it is scalable the way you say. And it's like, okay, now your hip flexors down through your quads, up through your abdominals. Okay, this is getting stronger, but then that has to tie into the point where you've got the 300-pound block on your chest and you're fucking leaning backwards so that your abdominals don't pop off. And the thing that gave me pause, what I was getting to initially with the push press to lean back, is that seems to have a quality of taking patellar tendons if you don't have the mobility, or if maybe you're a little too dry, or maybe you don't have the tolerance. Nathan Goldtrees, good buddy of mine, horrible accident happened at the log lift championships where he had a 440 log about a pubic hair away from lockout, and his patellar tendons went and he dropped it on him. He dropped it on himself. And I think there's other people that have had similar things. And again, that's all anterior chain. And it's like, for the fucking volume of posterior chain work you do, heavy. It's like, how much stabilization are you getting? And then in addition to that, how good are you at actually keeping that open chest and getting your spine to lean back? And a big part of that is probably, you look at guys like Mateus or anybody else, there's probably a person that's comfortable with that position from the get-go and they're more inclined to do it. But if you're not, it feels terrible and you never want to do it. And I know there are a lot. If I was Thor, I wouldn't go to my shoulder either. It feels like shit. So there's guys that if they struggle with it, it's like, well, I'm never doing a bag to shoulder unless I have to. And then by then it's too late.
Yeah. Well, I think there's like with the quads going pop and the anterior chain, I think there's three things that kind of come to mind for me there, right? One is strongman inherently biases the strongest posterior chains in the world. It's like probably the most posterior chain dominant of the strength sports, even surpassing powerlifting. So it self-selects for guys who just naturally have these really, really strong posterior chains. And there's guys that make it to a really high level without really having the strongest anterior chains. Like, you can see guys mask it by wearing wraps, guys mask it by doing a very hip dominant powerlifting style squat. It's like, but get them into like an upright posture front squat. And there are some guys that make it to a very high level without the respective quad strength to represent what they're putting over their head. So I think that represents an elevated risk. I think some guys also really avoid ever doing something plyometric in nature, right? So we don't get those elastic adaptations, and then suddenly we challenge them with huge weights in a show. And I think that does elevate, like, you can never get away from any risk. Of course, we're putting giant stuff over our head. Something might go pop. but I think there are very meaningful things you can do to mitigate those risks. And it's like training for elastic qualities, have a proportionately strong anterior chain. And also I think that so many guys lean into, oh, my knees are junky, so I do this very strict dominant style thing, and I don't do jumping. And so it's like, okay, well, you just hit 2 of those, and then you're going to get the third, which is, I would argue, is also that people have a very poor dip and drive mechanic. The number of guys that compete at the highest level that their heels are peeling at the bottom of their dip and drive, you want to talk about loading completely anteriorly without having a strong anterior chain. That's not how you do it. That's how you, if you said, Sam, I'll pay you to rupture your quad tendon, I would probably go load up as much weight as I can, and I would let my heels peel up, and I would do a dynamic dip and drive. That's probably what I would do if you said, Sam, your family's going to be set for generations if you can go walk out into your garage and disconnect your quad. It's probably what I would do.
And I would also not have a good front rack position. I would have the bar hovering off my collarbone, pulling me out in front, which is what most people, which is what I end up doing when I'm full, because you grow, you get tight, and you can't. And if you look at the mechanic, again, go back to the Klokov video, how many people can even get in that position with any implement that compete in strongman? Not even close. You're going to have shittier ankle mobility. Knees aren't going to be traveling forward as much, or if they are, there's going to be a shit ton of tension on them because of the immobility. And yeah, you're going to have the actual implement trampolining on your chest, and it's a recipe. And then when you talk about the plyometrics, that was another epiphany I had recently, because I've always like kind of, I don't want to say poo-pooed, but I never took seriously the athletic component of jumps and sprints and this and that or whatever. And then I talked to enough people. Asking Hooper about it is actually what kind of fixed it in my mind, because I'm like, okay, you're athletic, so that helps you with movement patterns and being adaptable and pick things up. But I asked him about durability. I'm like, so why are you so durable? Why don't you fall apart like so many people do when they're chasing these numbers? And he actually cited that. And he's like, yeah, I think just taking these high impact touches over so many years on the field prepares you to handle high loads. And that clicked in my head. I'm like, I never even thought of that. And it's true. And then funnily enough, trying to make a comeback way too quick without the necessary preparation that I've done in the past. My last show, I actually sprained my patellar tendons in warm-ups for the log. And then I look back and it's like, yeah, I was doing a lot of strict pressing. I wasn't doing my normal push press progression that I do. I certainly wasn't doing anything plyometric. I was doing nothing to build elasticity in my knees. And then I come in and it all makes very much sense when you start to look at it from that perspective.
One thing that's helped me a little bit, right? Because like you said, it can get really overwhelming of like, where do I put emphasis? And I think I think that's a difference in how you and I, because I love your videos. I watch every single one of them, bar maybe the masculinity videos. And I think that you often talk about like one day we'll have a model that's predictive of like you put in your genetics and it tells you like these optimal things maybe. And that would be truly the gold standard. And I guess that's so divorced from how I think about it, because it's like I believe that even the smartest people I've ever met really struggle with juggling so many high-minded concepts. That's why it's necessary to boil training down into these kind of phrases. And if you really understand the nuance of the phrases and the spirit of the phrases, they can make a high-minded sports specificity, like periodization thing, boil down into something you can actually make on the fly in training, right? Like, I think the amount of good that said, like, people telling people build strength, don't test strength. You could really extrapolate that upward into some really high-minded stuff if you wanted to, or you could try to understand just that heuristic for practical in the moment decision making. And the same thing is like, how do I balance all of these attributes? The way I do it personally, because I think I'm too dumb to try to do that in like a very wordy way, is in my head I have a version of me that's better at strongman, or what I think the best strongman would be like. And I just am like, well, this attribute is kind of close, so I can kind of leave it alone. Or this attribute that guy has that I don't have, I need to start addressing it. Right? You're talking about the best strong men and strong women aren't quite as good at the jerk as the best weightlifters. And I would argue also they have a good bit more strict shoulder strength. That would be like a difference between the best people at putting stuff over their head are Olympic weightlifters. They were federally funded to do so. They had a big gene pool. There's like whole coaching systems devised. It's the most far progressed of the strength sports. They decided the jerk is the best way to do it. The jerk is the best way to put maximum weights over the head. But when you start looking at objects with a bigger diameter, the demands for strict shoulder strength increase and increase and increase. So the best way to put a barbell overhead undoubtedly is a jerk, just as Olympic weightlifters do it, and the physical parameters that you need to be the best at it is just like a weightlifter. But we have varied objects. Axel, probably very weightlifting adjacent. Like that 105 kg guy that took Camby's former weightlifter, Klingen, whatever. The Russian guy who does the funny gym like Zerchers and stuff, who took Camby's axle lift.
Yeah.
Just the physical attributes of a weightlifter, didn't take a whole lot of preparation, just boom, pow, world record. So it's like, okay, those are the physical attributes that would be desirable. But we get to the log, and it's like the biggest log presses are guys who have stronger strict presses than like Lasha does. And I don't think Lasha could just easily break the log record without preparation. Part of that preparation would be the demands. And then you go really extreme like a Mouser block. The guys who are the best at the Mouser block are guys who are really proficient at that layback press. And you could argue, okay, well, they're all the techniques. You should be base proficient in a strict push press, jerk, maybe a push jerk, but that one's maybe a little bit more arguable because some people just, they don't have the mobility to do so. But like having some familiarity with that layback press is probably the most reliable way to do a Mouser block. So you like maybe be good at it. But in terms of like the physical parameters, I'm like, okay, well, what are the physical parameters of an Olympic weightlifter? Plus more shoulders. Very strong quads, proficient dip and drive, very good tendon elasticity, like force absorption qualities, but then they have more shoulders. And then you get into the trick of all of us in Strongman struggle with, which is, okay, well, I need to have stronger shoulders than my counterparts, but I also need to keep my mobility as close to them as I can, right? But that's kind of how I've navigated, at least, is I'm like, the version of me that's good at Strongman would be like pretty good at jumping and sprinting. Not the best in the world, but like pretty good at it. He would have good overheads. He would be statically quite passable. He would have good extension for high stone loads. And I really try to boil it down to just this fictional dude in my head that I think is pretty cool. And I just take steps, whether it's in my day with how I organize my day. The cooler version of me would be more organized. I should be more organized. The cooler version of me wouldn't skip doing plyos twice a week. It's a warm up. It takes fucking 10 minutes. Don't be a pussy. Do them. It's not that big. You know, just do it. The better version of you in your head, or this ultimate strongman in your mind, would probably do these. I'll just do them. You know, you've got kids and a real life. I don't. So it's a little easier for me to say that. But some of these things are very low level, right? The better version of me would make sure he always drinks at least 2 liters of water before he walks out to the garage to train. There's nothing that could happen that would like make it so that's not possible for me.
Yeah, and the heuristic aspect, as far as having the simple rules to follow, I mean, that is dead on, because in real terms, that's the only way you will get anything done. It's the only way you can get anything done is if you take the immense complexity and boil it down to something actionable, which is going to have to be, we don't deal with these types of heuristics because that is the truest, closest proximity to objective truth.
Yep.
We do it because it's the only thing we can do to get anything useful done. Which means, and the reason that I use that whole like AI supercomputer sequencing your genome is because that's what you would need to get to speak in the terms of like concrete things, this being optimal versus that, because really we're dealing with the realm of all possibilities given an immense amount of variables. And the people that do get caught in the high-minded shit, like I am guilty of all the time, even though I know better, it paralyzes you and you can't do anything useful with it. So it's better to take these broad principles and arrange them in a way that you can do something with them. And then if you're consistent and if you're not a head case, you can, go through the path of trial and error, and you hit so many good things there as far as evaluating what the best athletes tend to look like, the qualities they tend to have. We know what types of things today can get you closer to there tomorrow. And then as long as you have some reasonable intuition about how much of a recovery cost it's going to be, what you can reasonably pair together. That's probably where lower level lifters struggle the most when they try to do their own shit. I made the best mistake I ever made was starting a Discord, and I give them shit all the time because there's a really good energy. They love to lift. They're a bunch of crazy fuckers that are in there that are just going and coming up with the worst ideas ever. But I mean, if there's a complaint, and I always go back to what you said, it's like I can take somebody who's going too hard in the paint and get them to slow down, but you can't teach somebody to go full nut. So it's like, okay, we'll take that. But if there's a complaint, it's the overeagerness of like, well, I want the Olympic weightlifting quality. I want to be able to shoulder press 400 pounds. I want to be able to run a 4-minute mile or whatever. And then you start plugging things together. But conceptually, once you're training somebody or talking to them or teaching them, I don't think it's that difficult to get somebody to a point where they have a pretty good handle on how well those things fit together.
Well,
And
yeah,
then
it's just a matter of doing appropriate dosing of each of those training modalities to move towards those things. I think that's where like you go wrong. They're like, well, shit, if I need to put 405 over my head, I need to be doing it 5 days a week. And it's like, I don't need you to put 405 in your head over your head. I need you to be moving towards being more like that guy, right? And like you look at the best of them, we're like, if you implement training strategies to be really good at it, you're going to gradually become slightly more like the people that are the best at that thing. And you can overdo that, right? But that doesn't mean that just like, it's like people are like, well, if you bench press, your pecs will be so immobile you can't put something over your head. Eventually, yes. But brother, you are so far from having a level of pec mass that ruins your overhead position with just some base level mobility. You have to realize it's direction, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to go all the way there. To become the biggest strict pressure I could, I would just become Andrew Richard, right? But becoming slightly, and that would be bad for a lot of reasons for Strongman, but becoming slightly more like him might behoove a lot of people, in my opinion, at least. Shit, I had something smart to say.
Well, cut me off when you think about it, because
Okay,
I wanted to segue into. Well, it's not much of a segue. I mean, we're generally on the topic of overhead pressing.
I remember. Sorry, before I forget. I feel bad. I cut people off because I'm so afraid of forgetting some shit I've made up in my head.
Same way. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, I don't want to sound like I'm throwing rocks from a glass castle over here. I definitely am guilty of like over analyzing stuff, and I'm a big believer in like he who chases two rabbits catches neither, right? And you've got finite resources potential. I know that's a whole theory, is whether willpower is finite. These things are finite functionally, as far as I can tell, they are. Attention seems to be finite. So it's like we need to direct the attention not towards things that are kind of neutraling ourselves, but actively getting us better. And I think avoiding traits of like talk about like this cooler version of me, this ideal athlete, low traits of neuroticism is phenomenal. Because you're going to have to deal with high stress situations. So I always try to like select worldviews. I try to select opinions that move me towards that lower neuroticism trait, even though I'm very naturally high in that regard. But that was a big reason why I decided I would hire a coach, even though I've self-coached for 11 years. We have a lot of success. Obviously, from me yapping for a fucking 30 minutes here, I've got a lot of theories on training that I'm reasonably confident in. I'm very curious to honestly implement them. Most of the reason I train is because I'm just generally kind of curious how strong I can get while this window is open for me, and I'm willing to push quite hard to do that. Like, I just think it's very interesting, and I always have. And I don't know, that's the reason why I can't deadlift 1,000. I've got time. And I'm just curious. Maybe I'm wrong, and I want to find out. But because, like, oh man, I lost my train of thought again. Brutal. What was I just saying?
Well, there's a reason. There's a reason I'm on ADHD meds. I feel. You're saying there's a reason.
Yeah, the reason I hired a coach though is because I think I'm a firm believer we have like limited resources, and energy that is spent deciding what I should do is energy that's taken away from doing it well, right? And so I'm a neurotic idiot. I imagine if you had taken me a few years ago, I would have been the worst client in the world. I would have fiddled with stuff. I would have questioned everything to a non-productive degree, and I would have been a mess, and it wouldn't make me a good athlete. But I think understanding that dynamic, that coaches make shit athletes, I've steeled myself to break that stereotype and put my energy towards not second guessing the plan, not thinking about what I would be doing differently. I think that's a fucking waste of time. Of course, give feedback, but don't put your energy towards look at the program. Ooh, I've got this big day. What can I be doing to get ready? Time you spend second guessing the program and thinking about what I would be doing instead is energy that you're not putting towards I've got a fucking big day on Tuesday. Or if you're self-programming, you start second guessing. Well, should I do a big day on Tuesday? I'm a little run down. If coach said I got a big day on Tuesday, my job is to get ready. Maybe he's wrong, and we adjust as a team from there. But my job is to get ready. That means I do my mobility the night before. I make sure I'm hydrating. I make sure I don't miss a meal. And all of that energy, I think, historically might be wasted second guessing what it is that I should be doing in the first place. And I do think that if you have a coach you can trust on that level, it frees up a lot of that. Like, you're a very smart guy. And it's like, if you could full throttle put your time and energy into getting specific tasks done, they would probably get done at quite a clip. But then the amount of energy that's burned second guessing and deciding what should be done as you walk into the gym, I think takes a lot away from learning and develop. Like, me and my brother call it like a good athlete's intuition. There's like, or a good athlete IQ. There's some guys, it's like you ask them academically, they don't have any of the cool lingo to make us sound cool. They've got a lot of statements that maybe are only true for them, but they're really true for them. They have paid attention and been hugely emotionally invested in getting themselves better for the last 10 years. And they're wildly in tune with these small decisions. And so I think that if you constantly are working on thinking about yourself from a coaching perspective, you develop a great coaching IQ, but then you become blind to base level good athlete IQ moves. And the only way to get better at anything is to fucking do it.
I feel very called out right now because what you were pointing out, that isn't just my training, which is absolutely true. It's also my workflow. It's the dark side of being self-employed and having content. And,
Same.
There you go. Yeah, right. It's
I do exactly what you do, but badly. So trust me, I know. I'm also self-employed and have a much smaller YouTube channel.
No, keep doing what you're doing because you've got the core audience that's deeply invested, and you're growing like pretty well considering the diehards. It's like to go broad like I did, you end up getting out to the normies. You have to reach out past kind of who your core demographic. It gets weird, but it is exhaustive in my day, and then it's really disheartening when so much of my prime energy is spent having to outline and schedule and then second guess that, where by the time it's time to do something, it's like I'm kind of burnt. But it's the exact same thing with my training. And part of the reason that it gets me so much with my training is because I pride myself on a lot of the things I kind of sniffed out the hard way, because the experimentation I did, working with myself, solving my own problems that other coaches couldn't solve. It's like, okay, that gave me this deep kind of insight, I think, this intuition into concepts, at least, if I don't have a really concrete system. I was talking to Hatton about Alec's program, and he was talking about being a systems-based athlete. It's okay to be a systems-based coach and just make necessary improvements per the athlete. Everybody doesn't need their own system. And I've been so far back in like the conceptual fucking ether that it's like hard to draw that tether back down to earth, where it's like, no, this is the flow chart of what you do when, and I still feel the need to like experiment sometimes anyways. So it's like it's a weird thing to try to conceptualize what that plan forward would be for somebody that does want to become the best athlete they could be, while also kind of having the journey of lifting, because they can be counterintuitive. But then I talk to people like I talked to Philip Zayacek, the skinny kid, the 19-year-old. He won the fucking 90 kilogram class, and he's natty. Kid? Yes. And he says he's natty, and I believe him. Like at every step, I was like, this doesn't make any fucking sense. But I'm asking him about how he learned to train and coach, and he told me, he's like, I coach myself. I started programming myself. And I'm like, none of this makes any sense. I'm in the fucking twilight zone right now. This violates everything I've ever come to learn by working with athletes and talking to athletes and training and I'm like, but it worked for him. He was able to train, and apparently, either by his talent or his intelligence or his rigor and discipline, he was able to cobble together a system without falling victim to all of the things that would derail you or me, I guess, when we're left to our own devices.
I think that's the high neuroticism. And also I think part of it is like some guys really like the tinkering with training is part of the holistic enjoyment. And that's kind of something I'm interested to see. I don't know. I haven't gotten my plan from Alec yet. I've been very anxious because I've always done my own thing and I've always known what's on the horizon. I've always been great at taking those feelings of anxiety and putting them towards getting ready. Like, oh, I better go eat my meal, better go do my mobility, better go for a walk, get my steps in. I've always got an endless list of things that I need to do during the day, whether that's work or physical preparation related. And so that's always been like a great outlet for me. And so just the last couple of days waiting on the plan, I know I'm going to feel way better once I can see it and I can start, like, I love mental imagery training. My sessions reliably go a lot better if I've run through at least once in my head, whether it's the night before or on the treadmill beforehand. I make a lot better in the moment decisions because I don't get as overwhelmed if I've gone through it at least once in my head. The more times, the better. So once I can start kind of running through that first session and at least envision myself doing it, I'm sure I'm going to feel a lot better. But I don't know how Alec formats the stuff, and maybe there's going to be a lot of room, like maybe to make it sustainable. There might be some room for tinkering on the very back end of the workout, right? Not that I'm going to ignore anything, but I know Alec is very, very focused on like the progressions and the fatigue management and the technique on the main lifts for the day. And the accessory work, because he almost exclusively works with really high-level athletes, he just assumes they're doing it well and hard, because by the time then people make it to him, generally they're at least doing that. So I'm like, okay, well, maybe that's enough room to scratch my itch of like playing around with different executions on my cable rows. One set with a pause on the chest to kind of mirror a log, and then two a little bit heavier sets where whatever, right? Like maybe there's enough room in those assistance movements to scratch my learning itch of like, how am I going to overload these? If they are pretty generic, like just 3 sets, like am I doing top set, down set? Am I doing sets across? Am I doing rising sets? Is there enough there to kind of scratch the itch? And I'm kind of curious to see, because I've steeled myself for it, but I don't know. I think a lot of that also is just like, if you look at the guys that do the same thing we do, but they don't get in their own way, it really is those like low neuroticism traits where it's like, I've said for a long time now, I think John Hack downplays how much thought he puts into his training and how good of a job he does. Just having observed him for the last bajillion years since he was a USAPL champion, like he's always been one of my favorite lifters way back when he was the 181 or 183 USAPL champion for the first time. And he was coming up and it's like, oh, maybe this guy will catch Jesse Norris. He's got a great athlete's IQ. And it's like I think people mistake the fact that he doesn't have these high-minded talking points for not being a very intelligent guy, right? He's a chemist or whatever the fuck. And like the way he paces out his singles, people are like, he just goes heavier every week. And he's like, well, he's drawing upon the fact that he's done 25 powerlifting meets and how to pace out, like how to anticipate when I know he's talked about it. He takes Anadrol 5 weeks out. How exactly is that going to impact the singles? How is that going to pace out correctly? Where is this versus the last time it was 7 weeks out? And he does mention in passing that he knows all of these things. So this idea that John, like, and he's also been like, people are like, he goes to raves. He's like, I go to a rave once a year and I barely drink. But it does a lot for his public perception as the chill guy who doesn't even try. But very high athlete IQ. And I aspire, and like low neuroticism traits. And I aspire to get a little bit more like that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it is like he's so low when you talk to him, and it does seem like it is easy to mistake that for not being engaged or being checked out or whatever, and it's like you don't get to that level with those loads in a performance sport. I've heard of bodybuilders whose genetics were so good that, you know, they'd kind of fuck off on their diet and show up and just kind of eat whatever and play video games and still take 5th at the Olympia or whatever in the weeks before. But it is a performance sport. Like, you don't get to the level he got to, no matter how good your genes are, without having the attention to detail and knowing what's important and having a tally of that, certainly. So, yeah, that makes absolute sense. And since we are covering overhead pressing kind of as the backdrop of all of this, I want to take this and see if we can get to some brass tacks, because you have essentially coached yourself all the way up to this point. You have your ideas of training. You've paid attention to what works for you and experimented just so and had it turn out pretty well. So given that you're on this, or you were on this leg of the road to 400 press after having successfully clipped off the last couple of road to challenges, I'm interested a bit in how you actually structured it, like, you know, frequency, the blocks, the exercise selection, and so on. And really, I'm curious, how similarly did you structure your progressions compared to, like, say, your bench press prep?
Yeah, so that very similarly at first. That was kind of my jumping off point, because I was like, okay, well, I really honed in a formula for the bench press that involved, like, especially when I've been doing these Road 2 series, I put a lot of pressure on myself to not look like an idiot after, like, shot calling something. So a lot of my idle time is thought about, like, trying to make sure that lift in particular, my approach is good. And the same thing with, like, the deadlift. Honestly, the Road to 880 deadlift did a tremendous amount for my understanding and my ability to coach other people, because I really, really had to organize my thoughts past the level I had previously. You know, I've kind of thought of it. You have your specific deadlifting training, which, you know, you want to be doing an appropriate amount, an appropriate frequency, kind of generic terms, right? But and you want to be using variations that move you towards the technical model you have in your head. Different athletes, I think, should have different technical models. I've always known I tolerate flexion well, and I have very short arms and a long torso. More than likely, if I can lean into a slightly more thoracic, especially like if I can control a flexed thoracic position, I'm going to effectively lengthen my arms without giving myself a nightmare of a lockout, right? Like, I really liked your video on Konstantinov's, because, like, you're like, hey, he's built his system to control this position. Some of us probably need that position to pull at a really high level, artificially lengthen those arms. Whereas you can see some guys with the really long arms, they almost pull from a retracted position because they're going to be locking out their knee regardless. Whereas I kind of need everything I can without making my lockout a nightmare. And so select drills that reinforce maintenance of that position. And then I kind of, the term sound again, high-minded bullshit, but like areas of physicality. Look at high performers. Very, very in line with a lot of your stuff. What areas of physicality are tremendous performers in this? Very, very developed in, right? And like for the deadlift, I came to like the core areas of physicality. They've got very strong upper backs. They got a very strong midsection. They've got a strong posterior chain, and they've got strong general leg power. And I was like, okay, how do I think each of these is best addressed? And I was like, for most people, I think if you're just progressively overloading a vertical and a horizontal pull, you've got the upper back you need. Direct and progressive abdominal training. Usually I would say like one isometric, one like sit up or crunch pattern, and one leg raise pattern, right? Regional hypertrophy, upper lower ab are kind of different a little bit. And if I check those 3 boxes, even if it's one set a week, and I'm truly avid about progressively overloading those, that kind of gives me this background slow burn of my areas of physicality are reflective of a higher and higher level deadlifter, and that potentiates good specific deadlift training. And it almost lets me get away with fiddling around with the specific deadlift training because my physicality was coming up, right? Like posterior chain, I want an RDO, I want something that challenges the glutes in a squeeze position, because you've talked a lot about people can kind of lose, fucking kill me, that neural efficiency in the squeeze position, activation, dare I say, just something that challenges terminal hip extension. Because I think especially as your quads get really developed, your hip flexors get really tight, people lose access to terminal hip extension. So loading it progressively, whether it's a back extension, a hip thrust, a kettlebell swing, or pull through, and then some kind of knee flexion. Again, make sure those are just overloading in the background. Basic bodybuilding work, whether you go low volume, really intense sets, or straight sets across, a little bit more voluminous, don't care. And then general leg power, I really believe if you just worked on a squat and a unilateral pattern squat, again, and making an effort to overload those, you've got the leg power to deadlift what you want to deadlift. I don't necessarily think if someone's got a respectable squat and split squat that they need to be doing like deadlift stance specific work. And so I like took those same ideas and I was like, okay, let's scale these to the overhead press. What are the areas of physicality that we're looking at? Like we're looking at like strong shoulders, strong triceps, strong upper back, right? You could also argue that like kind of a strong midsection, but like again, the midsection, if we're challenging other really heavy axially loaded stuff, it's probably all right. If it's lagging behind, just make an effort to get stronger at front squats, and that box on some level will be checked. Like I just have a big enough base that I didn't really think about that one. So I was like, same thing with the bench press, right? Tricep, chest, shoulder, 3 main areas of physicality, and I would probably argue on some level upper back. Me and Freaky D, Dennis, disagree on this just a little bit, where he's just like, once your back is big enough, it's big enough, and getting your back any bigger, because it's not a prime mover, will not benefit your bench press. It's only if it's at a deficit of development that it will yield returns. I'm like, I get it. That makes sense to me. Anecdotally, training my back with an effort to overload alongside potentiated better performance. Couldn't tell you why. I get that it's not a primary mover. It's an antagonistic stabilizer at best. But I found that 4th area of general physicality to be like pretty helpful. So when I was leaning into the overhead training, I was running a very big, like I'm able to press 3 days a week. I don't think that should be extrapolated necessarily to viewers, although it might be. Press tends to respond to frequency pretty well. And I wanted to keep it pretty general in nature. So press 1 was a regular overhead press. Press 2 was press against light bands, just because I've always had good results with it. And then the 3rd press, I want to say, was a press from pins. Just pretty basic, vanilla lift, top end emphasis, bottom end emphasis. Just trying to get equal emphasis across the 3 days. They're not to potentiate good, like, again, trying to build up a general base. And then I found that, like, I'm not explaining this very well, but bear with me.
No, you are.
For the shoulders, I found that if I'm working something in a true vertical plane, whether that be a behind the neck press or whether that be with dumbbells so they would just pass through my head, but a true vertical plane, because a lot of guys lose access to that. And that's why they finish from this hollow position. I think pressing in a true vertical plane, tremendously helpful. Something like a dumbbell where the shoulder can kind of adduct in towards the center. A lot of guys lose their ability for their scaps to rotate upward. I thought it was great. It was great pressing volume for development. I get that there's a biomechanical argument that behind the neck work doesn't actually take your front delt through as big of a range of motion as a high incline. I know a lot of bodybuilders are big on that right now. Is like, no, high incline is superior for development. I think as far as work performance oriented, something in the true vertical plane and something in the high incline plane. High incline plane could be Smith. High incline plane could be barbell. High incline could be barbell to pins. I was doing that for a while. High incline could be Smith, barbell, dumbbells. Again, make an effort to overload it, but that was kind of like my base. That was my engine, so to speak. I kind of, for a lot of ways, think of my RDL is the engine behind my deadlift, and then I just need to build out the frame to be able to display that without deviating in position. I think of like the belts. For me and my brother, we use belt squat as the engine for the squat, and then we build out the frame to be able to display that horsepower. Because I believe a hamstring dominant deadlift is good, and I believe a quad dominant squat, raw squat, is good, and we build out the frame to be able to display that. I kind of viewed that pressing in that high incline and true vertical plane as the horsepower, and then I'm building out the ability to stabilize and express that raw horsepower in a proficient overhead press. So that was the shoulder one. Triceps for me, I think a lot of guys could lean into like more of a compound press type thing. But I've always found that the rate limiter for a lot of like the tricep, like close grip presses, a lot of the time the rate limiter ended up being my chest and shoulders anyway. And that which fails first is what's getting most trained most effectively. So I ended up having to favor towards more single joint-ish exercises, but going fairly heavy on those. So I did a lot of Smith JM presses. I think a lot of people, if you feel like your triceps are gassing up first, could do a close grip here. Close grip inclines are phenomenal. Dips, if you feel, again, dips, I always feel my chest fails first. So in my head, that's categorized as a chest exercise. Even if I bias my positions, it's still my chest first. Not that they're bad for triceps, but I bias towards like heavy JM presses and then heavy overhead extensions. Again, making sure that these are just chipping away. What I do specifically, don't get neurotic about it. Have fun. If it's working, leave it alone. But just make sure like a 10 RM is rising on my high incline press. A 10 RM is rising on my behind the neck press. My 10 RM JM press is going up. My 10 RM behind the neck is going up. Like, okay, cool. I've got kind of that pressing power. Then we look at like the upper back, the base we press from. Again, really basic stuff, kind of two categories. Do a vertical and horizontal press again. And then a little bit more shoulder function, hippy dippy stuff where I'm like doing like Powell raises through the week. I'm doing face pulls. I'm doing Y raises. Just making sure that my upper back, I challenge like end range mobility because a good overhead, right, when we lock it out, it's not being held actively by the front delt. We shift it back and we hold it with the upper back. It's just a better position. And I try to stay true to that. So I want to be doing some exercises like overhead shrugs, Powell raises, Y raises, trap three raises, that kind of background hippy dippy stuff that I do think is worth the time. And it's like, if you are the guy that was consistent with that stuff and the guy that wasn't, a year from now, their overhead finish position is going to look different. It adds up. I know it's little dinky dumbbells, but I really do believe in like that accumulation of marginal gains for that stuff. But I hope that answers you. That was kind of how I framed it out, was like I almost didn't stress as much about the specific sets per week and the overload parameters. Like I would adjust it up and down as my ability to recover. And I would go through basic phases of training, like percentage wise, really, really, really simple stuff there. But I wanted to just make sure, because I knew I was kind of far away starting. The bigger gap between me and that overhead press wasn't my overhead press technique, and it wasn't my fatigue management. It was the fact that I'm not big and strong enough. So I was almost more concerned with that latter half of the workout and those, let's just call them 10 RMs rising.
So with the exercise selection, and there seems to be a theme no matter where you go. There's going to be a certain amount of variety, right? It's like if people are training their back multiple times, they're probably doing different types of movements. If people are doing multiple pressing sessions, they're probably taking the opportunity to do very close variations, as opposed to, I feel like you don't see quite as often people doing the exact same lift repeatedly throughout the week. And it's always interesting to me how people conceptualize how they're going to range that. Like I've always thought of it like, okay, I have my main lift, the skill based thing that I'm probably going to take the most seriously. It's responsible for most of my growth. And then for variations, I always think in terms of like advantaged or disadvantaged. Disadvantage is probably going to be pretty good for hypertrophy, and it's also going to be good for strength in a weaker position, usually at the bottom. Advantage is going to be neurological because it's almost always going to involve overload, and it's also going to foster strength in top positions. To hear you kind of break apart how you conceptualize those different like for overhead, a true vertical plane, which I think is just objectively so good for just general size and strength in the upper body. And you're right, it's like a high incline. I mean, a lot of bench guys would do a high incline to help their bench. So it's like, if you want your shoulders, your true vertical pressing power up, that seems like a no-brainer. And then going from bottom end with the pins, going top end with the bands, and then spreading that out. So I'm getting almost DUP vibes as far as the different thresholds that are being worked on each day. So what I'm curious with now is how you kind of choose and distribute reps across that. An actual DUP would be like, I'm doing 8s on Monday, 5s on Wednesday, 12s on whatever. But this is obviously talking about the movement you're training. So I'm curious how you kind of select the set rep schemes, and then also if you tend to progress them all linearly together over a block, or if you have one that's kind of the heavy one that I'm pushing the hardest and the others I'm just clocking work. What are the metrics you look for when you're playing that?
Yeah, so really, I did the same thing with my bench press. I did something very similar with my deadlift. Early stages of preparation, I don't think of them as like a primary, secondary, and tertiary day, because I think the second you apply those labels, you need to start peeling back on the tertiary day to potentiate big performance on the primary day, which is a really powerful tool, because then you get bigger touches on the primary and you get those neural adaptations. Whereas if we go pretty hard on that third day, we're a little bit fatigued coming into every single primary day, so we don't get quite those neural adaptations. But because I'm not looking for neural adaptations yet, I'm looking for mostly like more muscular adaptations, I don't mind that I'm pretty fatigued all the time. So early preparation, equal emphasis across the three. And I have always been a big fan of using rep until RPE. Rather than guessing a set of 8 is going to be hard here at this percentage. Might be, it might not be. And I think a lot of people, to be honest, I don't want to be mean. I don't think they're strongmanning it. I don't think they haven't really tried it. People say, oh, the rep until RPE system, which kind of interesting. I learned John Hack does that in the off season. When I was younger, I was surprised more people didn't use that system. It's like, okay, would we auto-regulate the weight based on RPE all the time in lots of programs? Why don't we auto-regulate the reps? If anything, that would almost seem to me to be smoother. Like, I know in my preparation, based on just some basic percentages, to be prepared for next week, I need to touch this percentage this week. But if I'm having a down week, I do less reps. But I still get that adaptation and that neural touch to be ready for the next week. It keeps me, whereas if I auto-regulated the weight on a bad week, I feel like I might not get that touch and I might not be as prepared for the following week. So I felt like that always preserved training momentum a little bit better. And people are like, what are you thinking during the set? Fuck no, I'm not thinking during the set. And no one can think during hard sets to that level. Is that RPE 7 or RPE 8? Fuck no. Just like you don't think during the weight selected RPE set, right? You, based on your warm-ups, you get a realistic estimate of what would be that. You load it on the bar and you do it. You don't think during the set. Right? Same thing is I get a realistic calibration during my warm-ups of what roughly I think will be an RPE 7 number of reps. I do it. I assess whether I was right or wrong. I assess how much I'll fatigue for the next set. And I come in with if I'm hitting RPE 9, I'll rack it. Right? Like, that's pretty obvious when you've exceeded something badly. But that's how I do it, right? That way I don't have to worry about whether my rep selection, like my sets and reps are accurate, right? I come in with the goal of 3 sets of RPE 7 at 65% on the bar. That's a very generic hypertrophy phase workout for me. So early phase preparation, I'm running very similar percentages off of respective maxes of regular overhead against bands, overhead from pins. And they're just following a very similar progression scheme with roughly maybe I'll do one less set from pins because that's a little taxing for me. Just that is needed. But I'll run through like 60%, 65%, 70%, 75%. 3 sets across to RPE 7. Maybe the last one's a rep out. Very generic stuff. And I'll usually undershoot the first set as like a kind of calibration set, and I'll overshoot the last set to make the average out at the end. It's not the most precise thing in the world, and I don't like when people pretend programming. None of us can be that precise. And it's misleading to claim that if you overshoot by 1 RPE, the program's ruined. No, none of us are no one. I know a lot of high-level lifters. I'm very privileged to know a lot of high-level lifters. No one is operating at that level of precision, right? They're smart. They take one back offset off, or they do a back offset a little bit lighter to account for maybe that overshoot, but they're missing by a little bit all the time. So people are like, oh, well, there's some inherent inaccuracy from the rep till RPE system. I'm like, there's a large amount of inherent inaccuracy to anything. I don't mind that at all. That doesn't bother me. And I'll track like what's the most total reps I've done at 225. I'll try not to violate my RPEs, but next time I run through that wave, I've got 4 sets. I want to beat The most total reps I've done at 225. That's a metric. Like through the hypertrophy phase, I'm concerned with total reps performed, and I want to hit PRs at total work. Through the strength phase, I'm concerned with rep PRs, and then through like a standard peaking phase, I'm concerned with like quality PRs. As much as people like to dog on people for like the like technique PR or quality PR at a single, that is actually what I'm looking at through the peaking phase. Is I want like a 92% single that looks both the fastest but also the most positionally sound I've done that way yet. And that's kind of like my metrics for am I doing a good job at those different phases of training. Is am I hitting total volume PRs? Am I hitting rep PRs? Am I hitting quality PRs at like 88% or more?
For the RPE thing, like that's mind numbing for me too, because it matters when you're trying to make very, very precise measurements in like a research setting, having the difference between, you know, what is actual failure versus what is one in the tank. And the noise in there is going to have pretty big implications for the conclusions you draw. But that's irrelevant to everybody who's actually training, because especially for strength, the only thing that matters is, are you straining extraordinarily hard up to and maybe beyond the point of technical breakdown? Are you straining with some effort? And are you just kind of coasting? Those are kind of the three categories that I think define the most common RPE ranges. I think anything 9 to 10 is immense strain where you know, like, fuck me, this is it. And it's almost like, you know, 6, 7, 8 is substantial strain, and it probably doesn't matter either way if you're on the slightly higher low end of that, unless you have a habit of always just overshooting. And then everything else is a warm-up, or it's some token volume that's reinforcing technique or getting some modest amount of metabolic fatigue where it like feels kind of hard, but you still have reps in the tank. And that's about it. And like, I want to blow my brains out every time I see half RPE. Every time I see that, I just want to start throwing things. I'm like, what? No.
Really? I don't hate the half RPE.
Really?
Have you heard the people that say it's to denote a lack of confidence?
Okay, that makes a bit of sense.
That's how I've always heard like taught it. Is just like an 8.5 means you know you could have done one more, and you think you might have been able to do two more. And it's like I almost like my athlete. I want my athlete to convey that to me, that they're not confident, rather than just rounding to the 8 or the 9.
So every time I've had somebody, because I would have powerlifters in my gym, and every time, multiple times, people ask me to guess what their RP was based on how it looks. And I would have people. So do you think that's more like a 6 or a 6.5? That's always how I saw it first. So I didn't know, but I mean, I would intuitively do, if I wasn't sure, 6-7 or 7-8 or whatever. But even then, I think like just picking a number and like kind of moving on is probably as much resolution as you need. But it almost implies directly that. And again, if people are doing it that way, it almost implies that there is a level of precision you can have with an accurate rating, let alone does it even matter, which it probably almost definitely doesn't. And then on top of that, like I'm also a fan, it breaks down with reps. I'm a fan of RPEs, or not RPEs, AMRAPs. I use AMRAPs a lot in my training with everybody else. They're staple, especially Strongman. You need rep endurance, and it's a good driver of growth, and it prevents you from just going fucking heavy all the time. A lot of good shit with AMRAPs. But then it like really breaks down with AMRAPs, especially lift to lift, because how you experience or guesstimate like an RPE 8 in like a 1 rep max bench or squat or deadlift is going to be different than like an 8 or 10 in a bench. And that's going to be way different than what that feels like in a deadlift. And anyway, so this probably isn't a really popular take. I don't even like the proximity to failure measurement for RPE. Because especially with certain lifts, like a deadlift can deteriorate into the fucking ground, and you got 4 or 5 reps left. And there's guys that know that, and they push into that, where I have a sense of where it gets hard and I'm breaking blood vessels, but everything still looks good. And I'm like, I'm still going to call that an 8, even though I could have rest paused 6 more, gun to my head. And you know what I mean? So there's all these adjustments you're constantly making that are kind of you specific and kind of lift specific and kind of rep specific. And I can see why people get lost in it. But I mean, I think you're right, and the precision doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think it's tricky, right? Because there are a lot of things that people are functioning under, maybe who are successful using RPE, where it's like a lot of guys are saying like they're not counting those gun to head rest paused out reps. They're like, they've got a certain technical parameter that they want to stay within, and their RPE is based on staying in that technical parameter. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? Like different guys have different form breakdown tolerances, whether that's based on kind of propensity to injury or a technical model that they're working off of for their perceived long-term benefit or long-term development, like being sustainable. Because it's like, yeah, we've all seen guys that habitually go way are doing 5+ reps with insane amounts of breakdown. And it's like, again, in the short term, that's going to potentiate a big PR. In the long term, you might actually be shooting yourself in the foot for a smoother progression. Whereas if you stayed with the quintessential example is me. When I first started lifting, I just was in the YMCA as a 15-year-old by myself. No one taught me anything. I just saw deadlifts were cool, and I never learned a pure hinge pattern. And I gustoed my way up to 500 pounds over the next however long, right? And then I hit the hardest plateau of my fucking life because I was kind of running into the upper constraints of the non-existent technical model. And had I held myself to a little bit more of like the set ends here standard, whether we want to call that RPE or proximity to breakdown or technical RPE or a TAMRAP, as many technical reps as possible, like it's all a bunch of dorky ways of saying when this athlete should be ending their sets. And there's so many things that's dependent on that it's like, I guess I see your hangups on it where it's like, it's so hard that there's so many of these assumptions. It's very hard. Like you speak to very big audiences. You can't give prescriptive stuff with RPE without all of this nuance to a large audience, but it'd be really easy if you had a person because you're just like, kid, don't do those reps. Those reps aren't worth doing. That's it. That's all I'm saying. Yeah. There's no fucking fancy terms here. Those are bad reps. Don't do them. And people can be like pedantic. Go, there's such thing as a bad rep. In practical application, yes, there fucking is.
So just to give a layout so far, you have your movements that you like given by the things that carry over that you give kind of equal weight to. So let's say 3 days in this situation. You have what looks like a pretty linear block at least going 60 to 75% thereabouts, sets across, kind of medium RPE, maybe hitting an AMRAP at the set, and in the beginning kind of pushing them all together in stride because I'm not trying to set PRs right now or be as strong as possible. So I'm not worried about not being fatigued, because if you're completely fatigued, you're probably not training hard enough to grow to begin with, would be my guess for the reasoning behind that. And then now as we run through that block that you've laid out, you've made that approach. How do you conceptualize other blocks? Do you carry things through linearly and just drop volume to compensate? Do you like deloads? Do you like resets? And in the midst of all of that, what kind of changes are you looking to the exercises you use?
Yeah, so as far as deloads, on the pressing stuff, I have found I don't accumulate enough soft tissue issues to where that's necessitated from because there's obviously there's two reasons you might need it. You might need that little soft tissue reset, or you might need that kind of holistic fatigue, right? Like I get people, it's not CNS fatigue. Sure, I don't mind. I don't care what it's called. Holistic fatigue, right? Like the reason that after a big squat, the next day your bench is less. That one.
Thank you. Yes. Yes.
So I've found that when I'm pushing my pressing, not necessary. Maybe I'll have a mandated slight deload because I'll get less reps 1 week on my rep until RPE system. And that's almost kind of built in, like that's the auto-regulation nature of the program for my pressing kind of handles that for me. I'll just have a bad day, and that bad day was easier, and then I move on. And so I'll just run like a generic hypertrophy phase, a generic strength phase, which becomes top set, down sets. But same thing, equal emphasis across 3 days. And then I run back into the hypertrophy with an increased E1RM. Over time, as soon as I'm starting to hit sets that give me the inkling that I'm getting a little bit closer to the level I would need to be to do that, like I'm hitting maybe E1RMs within 10%. No, that's maybe a little bit less than that. I'm hitting E1RM sets on the overhead on the main day that project to at least 365, 370. Right? I'm like, okay, I'm starting to get closer, and I'm doing this under fatigue conditions. So I'm actually a little closer than that would indicate. Not that the E1RM calculator is accurate, just a general proxy for I'm starting to get at least in the territory. Then what I'll start doing is I'll keep running that hypertrophy strength structure, and I'll start peeling down the third day so the big first day goes even better, right? And then if I'm like, okay, I really kind of want to know where I'm at, I'll go hypertrophy, strength, peak. and I'll peak out to a single, not maybe a death grind, but I'll peak out to a single to let me know where I'm at. If I'm really close, then the plan is to run hypertrophy strength, peak again, and hit it. And that third day can become very flimsy towards the end, to where it's like kind of an active recovery day. Maybe it's some generic speed work. Maybe it's positional work. Whatever I need to do with very light weights to not just rest, but hopefully potentiate a better performance on the primary day. I don't like taking that day off. Part of that's because I'm a nut and I like being in the gym and I hate not training 5 days a week. And part of that is just because I do think there's things I could do on that session that give me a better result than just resting, right? Whether it's challenging positions, whether it's challenging technique, whether it's kind of power-oriented work. I want to say at some point there was a study that like doing speed work 2 days before a big lift may be good. I don't fucking know. I've found that doing something on that day rather than taking it off was good. And then I'll run, if I was close, I'll run through it again. And if I wasn't close on that run at that time I peaked, again, I'll drop back to just running hypertrophy strength, hypertrophy strength, hypertrophy strength. Until I'm ready. And that was very much what I did with the deadlift is I ran this very general alternating phase. I started to suspect I was a little closer than I thought. I actually had a contest that lined up perfectly. I ran a 10-week prep for the contest and I hit 855. The 855 moved well. I'm like, okay, I'm within batting range. So then I laid out a whole block, again, a little bit more aggressive with the fatigue management to potentiate big primary days. Like I do RDLs on a secondary day for my deadlift. So for most of the block, my deadlift day is pretty fatigued, and I know that. So most of the time when I was like peaking my deadlift, all the way through the strength phase, I would have RDLs on a second day of the week, earlier in the week too. So my deadlift would move a little slow, and like my 89% move like shit. But I know the next week I'm not going to do RDLs earlier in the week, and I've proved to myself with time not to freak out about that 89% being shitty. Next week, 92% will move better. And that happened every single time to where even my neurotic ass, I knew it would happen. So if fucking 89% moves at all after some max effort RDLs earlier in the week, I'm in great shape. When I drop out those RDLs, 92 is going to fly, 95 is going to fly, take a week of rest, give her a go.
With the driver exercises that you talked about earlier, I thought I meant to touch on that and I let that thread go. That was one of the more interesting things I've heard about exercise selection was thinking conceptually about something that's actually going to contribute the horsepower to a lift that isn't in and of itself the main lift. It seems like a pretty unconventional take, even though I think it makes a lot of sense. Like I've advocated for like, hey, standing presses are great, but you know what? Being really stable on a seated press with something to push back against, probably really good for maximizing maximal force production. And it makes sense similarly with a belt squat, not having to worry about your torso and so on. I have two questions as far as that goes. One would be, do you have a similar movements for deadlifting and benching that aren't deadlifting and benching? And two, do you typically put those horsepower or kind of driver exercises as main lifts, or do you like them more as accessory?
Yeah, so that's actually something I had to change recently. One thing I've been talking a lot about on the channel is frequency being informed by absolute load. If we look at high performers in like a lightweight class, right? They're equally advanced, very advanced, great lifters. And they are still, let's just say deadlifting twice a week, right? Let's just use that as an example. And then we look at high level, super heavyweight lifters, and they're only doing rigorous deadlifts every other week, right? Difference being the absolute loading is higher. Absolute loading seems to come with these great, whether it's just soft tissue. I don't think it's just soft tissue. Like your wonderful friend, Paul Carter, has made some points about like, you're 100% the same as mine. I don't believe that to be true. I really don't.
That doesn't
I
make
think
any
that
sense.
could be, someone should tell Hafthor that if he squatted twice a week, he'd get stronger because it's working for me. So it's like this is very silly. We can observe high level performers, commonality, not uniqueness in high level performers. We see these lower frequencies. And it's like eventually you get strong enough where the absolute weights you're moving on a squat and a deadlift is like, it necessitates that you only squat and deadlift once a week, right? And eventually you get so strong that you're only rigorously doing them every other week. And I kind of hit that point a little sooner. I thought I was going to be like more of a 9 some odd deadlift and an 8 squat some odd guy before I started running into that. And I started getting the signs of like accumulating fatigue way too quickly to where just recently my brother and I have switched over to kind of that alternating alternating split week. So to answer your question, what I had done, I used to do 3x per week lower up until, I don't know, let's just say a 6 to 650 squat and a 700 deadlift. And then I switched to a 2x lower. And I felt I was managing my fatigue a lot better that way. I was getting to the point where I was not having productive training on that tertiary day. So why not just give myself more rest? So I moved to a 2x frequency. And what I was doing was squat, secondary deadlift on day one, deadlift, secondary squat. That's what I was doing. So I was kind of a 1.5 frequency. But that's what I would do is I would do the engine of the deadlift being the RDL after my squats and be pre-fatigued until I needed to strip that out. And I would do my pause squats or my heavy belt squats after my deadlifts as the engine of my squats until I need to strip those out. And I really want to display squat strength. And then recently what my brother and I have had to switch to is alternating weeks. We've been calling it Big Saturday, where you got big squat sets, light deadlift, RDLs, and then light squat sets, big deadlifts, big belt squats. So that way you're not really going a whole week without challenging difficult hip and knee extension, because on the down week, you're still doing the difficult belt squat or you're doing the difficult RDL. And that's worked very well for us thus far. Talking to Alec, he's a big believer eventually, like he's convinced because we're young, eventually we'd have to go to doing the belt squats on the heavy squat week. So that way you truly do have 2 weeks between rigorous squatting. I think he's going to have me do it. I'll see how it goes. I'll report back. More than happy to be like, I'm fucking wrong. The guy who coaches a bunch of the strongest people in the world was right. My dumbass in Montana was wrong. I'm more than happy to admit that. But for the time being, that seems so far off what I need. Like I'm able to recover from the RDLs on the squat weeks. And that it builds at least some confidence that I haven't gone a whole 2 weeks between like difficult hip hinging.
So does that then just leave you with Big Saturday? That's kind of the one lower body workout per week, or do you have like a lighter feet or lower body exercise?
Yeah, we've got a day, and honestly, it's been really, really good. We've got a second lower day that we do all of our tier 3 movements, which has been a tremendous, honestly, a huge benefit because Max and I have been kind of slugging along on that higher frequency with these big absolute weights where like Max is fucking ripping 700 for rep squats like every single week and then doing like the RDLs. And it doesn't leave a lot of energy to really empty the tank and do meaningful sets on the split squats, on the leg extensions, on the good mornings, like that tier 3 stuff. Because Max and I do good mornings as tier 3. Doesn't matter, just side note. And we're left with a lot of energy or training economy in the low back or kind of holistically to do those. So that's honestly been the kind of the hidden huge benefit is moving all of the tier 3 stuff, both the deadlift and the squat tier 3 stuff, go to that second lower day. And we're going pretty fucking hard. We're going actually very hard on that day right now. And if we had like a really big squat, a really big deadlift coming up, we would obviously peel back that second day. But the amount of work that is like effort that's been freed up for those tier 3 stuff has really kind of freed both of us up for, I think, smoother long-term progression because that base has started growing again at a little bit bigger of a rate than what it had kind of petered out to when we were exhausted from having to squat and deadlift to these big projected E1RMs on a weekly basis both.
Yeah, people really don't take into account how difficult it is once you start stacking exercises if you're trying to progress them all or at least do something substantial with all of them. And as you get stronger, in addition to that, I mean, one of my favorite programs to run is really it's a dumb program because it's just a big hammer, but it's repeating sets of 10 or 8 across multiple compounds. And by the time you get to the last sets of the last compound, and then there's isolation after that, you're like, I don't even have anything left for the isolation. I was hanging on by a thread. And if you survive it and pace yourself well, it's very productive. You grow, you adapt, but you accumulate just a fuck ton of fatigue. And then it arguably becomes unsustainable for a lot of people as you get into heavier thresholds. It is really a mother. It's like if you really get a good stimulus from like a deadlift and an RDL, it's like what else can you do after that isn't worthless? So splitting that up, and then that does actually look like the Lily Bridge template, the alternating squat and deadlift on the heavy days with the second day that's bodybuilding work. And it's like you get good token volume, you get blood flow. It's probably more restorative, probably better.
Do you remember Izzy Navarez?
Yeah.
He made like that. Yeah, he made that takedown video of the Lily Bridge method, and it's like it's funny because he's since like felt really bad about that. Is I didn't know the game changed when you get stronger, and I was like, I watched it back. I don't think he said anything wrong, most people buying that template don't fall into the sub-demographic for whom
Yes.
this becomes best practice. Look at the high performers around your weight class to give you a slight, like, again, they're late stage though. Even that might not tell you much. You might just be seeing hyper-specific training. And early training career, they were doing more generalized training. So that might not even tell you anything. But at least it tells you more than just looking what someone who's a far cry. Like, that's my least favorite thing is like big, super heavyweight, untested guys giving like women in their gym these ultra low volume, ultra low frequency programs because I'm big and strong. So it works for me. So it's going to work for you. And it's like she could do literally 10 times that volume and see progressive benefit. And if you can't understand that your training isn't just, you figured it out. No, the human body can't recover from a deadlift in 7 days. Yours can't because you're strong as shit. That kid with the 3-plate deadlift, yes, he can recover. He's a fucking 15-year-old. He can recover from it in like a day. What do you mean 7 days? You're over. Like I used to work for this guy who was like a old school, high level guy. Like pre West Side era, like single ply drug tested era type guy. And he would come in and he would tell me I was overtraining every single day. And I was like, I feel like $1,000,000. Is this what overtraining feels like? He's like, trust me, you can't bench more than once a week. And I was like, I think I can bench 5 days a week. I don't know what you're talking about. And it was like this big, like I worked for him and we would butt heads over it. And I was like, but I'm getting better. And he's like, I benched 500 back in the day, which, hey, by the way, took me a while. I got there, still benching 3 days a week.
Boom.
I didn't die.
Boom. And the funny thing is that is one of the reasons like I give so much leeway to people even have big ideological problems with, like Ripito is a great example, because as many things as Ripito says or hills he dies on, whatever, the big fucking rocks, the important stuff, not only is he right on, but he spread it to a really big audience, because you can find that exact assessment in fucking starting strength or in practical programming, because the entire thing is based around the fact that, hey, if you're very weak and you're very small, you actually are too weak to fuck yourself up. Recovery is not really an issue. So why wouldn't you go in and do the biggest workout of your life every time you get a chance to do it? And then, hey, how do we evolve once you hit a brick wall? We just move the sessions further apart. We have offset days. It's that exact same pattern.
Yeah, and that's like, plus honestly, like I also, same thing, kind of give some leeway to some people that are dogmatic, because it's something that you mentioned earlier that I think is a really, really good point, which is that like you can almost get completely frozen by the number of things that can work. And that's why like I'm totally pro. Almost every good coach I know has a system. I used to think when I was younger and I was getting into coaching as a job, I used to be under the impression that, a good coach would be the most flexible one. He's got some of his guys run a conjugate, and some of his guys run block, and some of his guys run this because it's what they respond to. And it's like people can have pretty predictable responses between different people, and you can piece together a system that fills in the common gaps that emerge within that system. And I would much rather have a guy who's extremely versed in what to look for on week 7 of his American block periodization. Like I want a guy who knows what a single is supposed to look like at this point in the block, right? And how to, like, of course you need some flexibility. Different people need different volumes. Different people need absolute strengths, need different frequencies, right? I'm not just throwing every woman on a every other week frequency, but at the same time, right? Like, I prefer system-based coaches, and I also like guys on YouTube that are a little bit dogmatic, because it gives people a jumping in point. I think some of us get really like, I can never be wrong, because it's such a bad feeling to be wrong on a public forum that everybody starts gravitating towards the same language of non-statements that are technically all correct, of like anything works, all exercises work, yada, 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 like these kind of non-statements. And it's like, that's great. And they're like, it's good because we're taking away people's fear of exercise. But guys in the comments are like, fuck, man, give me a jumping in point. Just tell me to do some skull crushers. And it's like, I'm super guilty of this because I hate being wrong. And I'm pretty good at talking in circles. So I can avoid ever saying, like, it probably stunted the growth of my channel. At some point, someone needs to nut up and say, like, yeah, there's a bunch of fucking ways to do this. Do this. Just jump in here. Here's a program, right? Like, someone needs to be Rip and just be like, stop being a fucking dork. Do a 5x5 overload. Great. Someone needs to just say, here's my routine, here's my system, without all the qualifiers of like, or like people, you don't want people to nitpick your system. And I kind of get that because it's like I put so much time and energy into devising like a lot of what my clients do that it's like I almost don't want to share it. Not because I think it's like some proprietary secret stuff, but it's like if someone trashes it, it kind of trashes like my thoughts over the last 5 years that I've worked on. And it's like someone's gonna trash it, and it's like that hurts me a little bit more than someone like oh, you fat baldy. That's fucking fine. I don't really care. But someone's like, this is a dumb program. I think it's pretty good. You.
Yeah, the big fucking tragedy of all of this is we do need people because it is stupid. The hard thing isn't that you have to walk a tightrope to grow. The hard thing is that there are so many goddamn things at work. But that doesn't mean you can do anything. It means that there's these different like hills or constellations of principles, but you still have to like navigate them correctly and do. So it's like, how is it better for anybody to say, hey, there's 37 different maps you could follow? Well, just give me one that's pretty good that I'm probably not going to fuck up. But the tragedy is that nobody's going to follow it without the dogma and the sales pitch behind it. Yep. Because if you have, I mean, I've kind of I have my ideas that I'm firm on, but I don't have like one system. I have a couple of traits that I move around, and my writings have kind of been about how to do things broadly. But then the thing happens, I'm like, hey, here's a bunch of examples to do it differently. Well, people intuitively want the jumping off point in the map. So they're like, oh, I'm going to run everyone in sequence. And I'm like, well, that's not it either. And it's like, well, Jesus Christ, maybe I would have been better off like picking a system and just kind of sticking to that because people aren't better off for knowing every single possible variation that they ever could have made because, and you're right, systems-based coaches, like, they don't even do that. Yep. It is going to be the guy that knows exactly what to look for at week 7 of their block of American periodization. It's not going to be the person that has so much breadth that they have some vague, it's like jack of all trades, master of nothing. So that's
always my fear with the coaching, right? Was I didn't want to be the guy who's like, well, I'm half decent at conjugate and I'm half decent at this. Cause it's like, you can learn the nuances. Like, does conjugate make sense to me for raw power? No, it doesn't. That's the least controversial thing. I'm fucking 15 years late on that being a hot take. But at the same time, I also could more than happily acknowledge that, yeah, if you took a guy that I thought was a smart guy that really cared about training, and he spent 10 years learning the nuances of how to exercise, like select exercises and what to be looking for at different points, of course it'll work. It'll work quite well, right? It's not unique to the program. A lot of guys on YouTube would be better off running just like a base derivative of 531 with one of the ones that includes a little bit more volume. Any of them, I don't really care. But like one of 531 with more volume and just leave it the fuck alone would outperform these a lot more flashy and honestly smarter programs just leaving it alone. So it's like at that point, like half of the service I'm providing is just stopping program hopping, which kind of frees me up a little bit.
Yeah. That's the big, and that, I could get into that too, because then there's program hopping, and then there's, I don't know, there's a movement now. It's like, well, you should be able to hop programs because as long as, I don't know, effort or whatever, I could go on. The different ideological denominations that exist give me heartburn and trigger my neuroticism because I want to solve them all, and you fucking can't. I wanted to ask too. I wanted to ask how your brother's doing. Last time I talked to you, I mean, you were in the throes of making a monster. I think he was chasing like a 2,000 pound total at like 18 years old. Like how is his development coming along?
Yeah, so he got the 2K total below 20. We got that done. At the time, we got the heaviest deadlift done in competition below 20. I think it's still, for whatever, you got some Strongman fans, for what it's worth, it might still be the heaviest conventional done below the age of 20. It's been blown out of the water by Theo Maddox, who did way more as a teen sumo, which fair enough. Things have progressed really smoothly. We're looking at doing a USAPL meet before July. His birthday's in July. It's a bit of a stretch goal, but we really want to do 1,000 kilos, so 2,200 before 22.
Wow.
We would need really good training. I'm very familiar with Max's rate of progression. I'm very familiar with like how things have been going. I've coached him for 10 years, right? Like it's been a very slow, steady grind. But I do believe it's within his capabilities because that's something like Max kind of picked out when he was like 15, which is so funny because it's like you talk to any 15-year-old who's picked their goals about what they're going to do when they're 22. And it's not based in reality, but so far he said 2K by 20, 2,200 by 22 because he had seen that was like kind of indicative of the trajectory of the best guys, right? Like Luke Richardson and Pavlo Nekonechny both hit 1,000 kilograms before 22. and that was like, these represent the pinnacle of pushing the sport forward. We lost both of them to strongman and injuries, but that was kind of something he had right in his mind, and we've been chipping away in a very sustainable way. And last block, he squatted 815, deadlifted 835 on the stiff bar, and then his bench kind of fell off a cliff because he got the flu. And we're in the process of regaining our training momentum on that one. It's coming back a little slower than I thought it would, but I'm not too worried about it. It was just like we were in good shape around like the 505 range, got sick, lost some body weight. We managed to kind of get him in the gym because he was prepping for a contest he had to pull out of because here's a crazy one if you haven't heard this. Snowstorm the day before we drive over to Spokane, Washington. Max decides he's going to drive anyway. Makes it 200 feet from our house, puts his car in a ditch. Some guy drives by and is like, yo, you want me to pull you out? Max says, hell yeah, I got to get to this meet. Straps a chain to his rear axle, gets a 30-foot running start, and bends his rear axle and snaps off the left rear differential. So we did not go to Spokane. We just did a little mock meet in the gym. But that was a real shame because he was in very good condition. The bench was going to be down, but we were going to hit big PR. We did in the garage, which honestly it was negative 20. I think I would argue that was harder than doing it in contest. But now we're signing up for another meet to get out there and chase that goal. He's just switched over to this lower frequency, and so far it's been amazing. A lot of that's just expressing strength by being under lower constant fatigue conditions than the old training model. So it's like, technically, every big Saturday, he's hit like this awesome rep PR, but we're both have been doing this long enough to not read into that too much and think like, oh, we cracked the code. Because like Dave Tate has talked about that a bunch of times. Like, yeah, lower your training volume. You hit PRs by being under less fatigue. Keep doing that. Keep doing that. Your work capacity gets really low. Be really strong with a really low work capacity is kind of marching into an injury. It's not a sustainable training strategy. You're effectively just doing this prolonged peak of teetering your volume off a cliff and saying that's what you respond well to, when it's like really what you're doing is expressing. So we know a lot of what we've done is expressing, but I think I'm not too worried because we've freed up so much training economy with that second lower day to continue the base building, do a lot of just physical work, keep the work capacity high. He's a big boy. He's 340, but we make sure he does his cardio, accumulate zone 2 stuff, both for just like general aerobic condition to keep his recovery good, try to keep his blood pressure good. He's a big boy. There's certain accommodations that need to be made for that. But a lot of it will come down to, like, we've switched his technical model for the bench. We kind of bought into this idea that a soft touch, because I think there's two types of benchers. There's guys who are, everything is about positional maintenance. I call them like positional benchers. Very, very widespread in the higher levels of lightweight classes. And then you have kind of power benchers where speed actually kind of matters, right? Like you look at like someone like Julius Maddox has never done a slow maximal lift. It's either fast or he doesn't make it. A lot of Josh Bryant's guys, like a lot of their training is compensatory acceleration work. They treat it almost as more of a power event, and none of them can grind. They blow it up off their chest or it comes right back down on them. And they've kind of leaned into this power-centric, like, obviously you have to be big, you have to be strong, but rate of force development, speed off the chest, is a quality that's like innate to the bench press. And you always saw that the lighter guys always were positional benchers for the most part. And we've always thought, like, look at Kirill Sarachev. If you're a big guy, big guys are getting away with a suboptimal bench. And if they leaned into being a positional bencher, they'd be better. And we spent 2 years really developing Max as a positional bencher, and we did not get rewarded for it. We progressed at the same speed we would have otherwise. He made night and day progress in his technique by all accounts. Everybody says bench looks so much better, and we were not rewarded for the amount of work I spent, like watching his bench, watching his videos, hanging out in the garage with him. And so I'm starting to open my eyes to the idea that maybe for bigger athletes, it's not just that they're getting away with it, but this power dominant bench model for bigger guys is more viable than I thought. And so we're kind of transitioning our training of him and our thought process for like what makes a good set into being a little bit more of a power dominant guy. And I'm pretty confident that's going to be the breakthrough we need to be as good of a bencher as he is squatter and deadlifter. Because if he can put up like 850 on the stiff bar in a meet, that's like top 10 all-time drug-tested stiff bar pulls. Like, he's getting up there. Squat's not quite where it needs to be for a super, but it's coming along really well. He's not a full-size super yet. Just eventually, like very slowly and methodically filling out the weight class should put us in a good spot with the squat. The bench is the only one where I'm like, hey, maybe we need to revamp our approach a little bit.
What do you think is is to blame for the lack of return? Do you think it's that he's benched one way so long that this slightly different position requires strength and development in areas he hasn't developed yet? Or do you think that there's like a trade-off in a more optimal setup, not having the developmental punch, so maybe it's not sustaining strength and development in him for every touch he does? What do you kind of lay at the feet of that kind of unimpressive return that he got?
Yeah, so I can't imagine it's physicality, because we spent 2 years being pretty meticulous. Like, I can't imagine that it's that he lacks area in his body that's necessary to perform this task well. If anything, like, Max and I are a great athlete lifter combo, because Max is wildly averse to changing things if they're working. That's just kind of his, and he's very laid back. Like, Max, I think, because he decided, like, it was the first thing he was ever good at. He was good at powerlifting, and he's like, I want to be like a top guy. We always looked up to like Eric Lulybridge and Andre Milanichev were like the coolest guys in the world. And I think he intuitively, Max, terrible coach. We had him try it. I was like, hey, Max, I've got a lot of demand. Like, I turn down a bajillion people a week. Do you want to coach? Like, that could potentially, like, you could stay at home and make your meals, and we dip our toe in the water. No, he does not have self-employment is not for Max. He needs someone to tell him when to show up, or shit does not get done. But tremendous athlete IQ, but maybe not the best coaching IQ. And one of the things he honed in on was like, I need to keep my life stressors low. And he's made a lot of decisions to kind of potentiate that, right? Like, he picks a job that's low stress. Max is a very smart guy. He could easily move up the ladder, chooses not to, turns down promotions, like, makes a lot of decisions in his life to keep his stressors low. And I think that makes us pair well, and he's resistant to change. But I talked him into this positional benching, and we were very, very meticulous with like building up the physicality and the technique. So at this point, I've been like, okay, as much as I'm curious why exactly, sometimes you don't ask why, you just go with like outcome data, right? Like, I think getting so hung up on, it's like people who are obsessed with mechanistic data. I'm more concerned with outcome data and implementing that well than I am with mechanistic data. Like, sure, in the background, I might wonder why. But I have put a tremendous amount of thought into why I think it wasn't that we were rewarded. I've just taken a more zoomed out view and say, okay, again, look at the weight class. Maybe this was where I was going wrong, is I was looking at great benchers in a lighter weight class. Look at the great benchers in his weight class. Honestly, most of them lean towards being power benchers rather than positional benchers. Let's just not say why, and let's just say, okay, there's two technical models. One of them is more prevalent in the weight class. We're trying the less prevalent one, and it's not fucking working. Okay, maybe we should do the one that more high-level super heavyweight benchers are using. And I'm pretty confident, based on the early signs, that a little bit more of a sink, accepting the bar, getting more active leg drive. Like, I couldn't tell you why the more active leg drive component of the bench, because it's not like he misses off the chest. He doesn't need that more punch. But I do believe the leg drive contributes more to the horizontal travel of the bar than the vertical travel of the bar. Like, if we look at the direction of leg drive, we're trying to slide towards our spotter. We're not hip thrusting the weight up like a lot of newbies do. We want our leg drive to keep tight, so that way we can keep the press a slight decline, because muscles that press downward are stronger than muscles that press upward, just anatomically, right? We can dip more with equal training. We can dip more weight than we can bench. We can bench more than we can incline. We can incline more than we can overhead, right? So if we can cheat and turn that bench into a slightly lower plane, positionally, I do believe those muscles are a bit stronger. But also we want to establish good contact to directly transfer leg drive into getting that bar going backwards. And so we've just been leaning into that. And it's been promising enough that, like, once it works, I'm speaking into existence, once it works well for him, I'm going to put a lot of thought into exactly why I think that is. Because, like, obviously there's just a difference. Like, super heavyweights, the game is very different, right? Lighter weight class guys fill out their weight class with about as much muscle as they can have, especially genetically elite guys, pretty early in their career. The top 165 guy in the world has filled out that class with pure muscle since he was like fucking 18, right? Because he's a genetic freak. He built the muscle easily. He filled out the class. So it's really sharpening neural and technical qualities to display that strength. super heavyweights can just kind of build the base indefinitely. Like there's no such thing as a big enough base. Like so that even late stage super heavyweights, that tier 3 stuff, just especially because you have the time to, because you're only squatting every other week. You got plenty of time to do in between. You are hammering on like the building the machine, like using the machine well is one thing. Building the machine bigger, you never stop building the machine bigger. And the fact that like supers have an infinitely big machine, maybe that has something to do with why the power dominance bench does something good. I don't know. That was really wordy. I don't know.
No, that's, I mean, it's true when you look at it because the best benchers are going to bias toward, I mean, Julius Maddox is probably one of the biggest, most muscular men to be a really good bencher next to like Eddie Hall, next to, I mean, Kirill Sarachev was, though he doesn't look as big, he's like, what, 6'8" or some shit like that. He's huge. So I'm curious about the positional thing because there's this debate of I remember seeing certain followers, I want to say West Side followers, but powerlifters cue down towards the feet using the decline rationale. You talked about trying to do the straight line using the stronger muscles as opposed to the people that will kind of arc back over their face to get the bar closer to the pivot point, which is your shoulders. Lower the moment. It sounds like you're saying that you're trying to emphasize hitting low using that musculature, but then do you come back up? How do you cue the positioning for?
Yeah. So I guess I should rephrase. I'm not saying to press in a straight line. Bar J curve needs to travel back.
Come back over, right? Okay, I got it.
That needs to happen.
Okay.
I've always argued that like you see guys press it way out, and it's like that's not a sustainable position for a raw bench press. It needs to J curve back. It's funny because people will cite that old Bill Kazmaier bar path analysis. Bill Kazmaier's bench is not exactly what we see the other great benchers doing. So I don't know if Bill Kazmaier has the most exaggerated J curve. Who was the other? Was it like Mike Bridges or Larry Pacifico or something? The other one in that study, the other good bencher, is probably the bar path, the less exaggerated of the two. Is probably a little bit more like what we should be looking for. It's a little bit more like what we want, right? Depending on how wide of a bencher we are, how flared, like you'll see a lot of positional benchers are a lot more flared than we used to believe in, like the ultra tucked. I think the ultra tucked is a remnant from equipped because that puts more stretch across the suit. I don't believe in that ultra low touch point. I don't believe in the exaggerated elbow tuck. I believe in neutral to flared, whatever we call neutral, right? The higher the touch point is on our chest, the more pec dominant our pattern is, and the less horizontal travel there is total. But I'm a big believer in we arch through the thoracic, and that's why the thoracic mobility is key, because while we're still doing this J-curve movement, we can still keep it at a decline, right? It's not a straight press at a decline, but we still want that press to be more downward than flat, just because I do believe those muscles to be stronger. If we can keep decline and have this tricep dominant lockout, I think it's better than if we flatten out and lock it out with our chest and shoulders. I just think that the upper end potential is higher. I think that not driving the bar back at all represents a technical fault that's going to limit someone's result. But I've come to believe that driving the bar back too early is sometimes a large technical fault as well. I don't want it to be like, here, come back up. I think that isn't a smooth J curve either. If we come back to this idea of the J curve being the gold standard, okay, well, what is this thing where we go here, back, and then up? That's not a J curve either. Chad Wesley Smith was always obsessed with getting the bar back early. I never really liked his bench very much. It was never his best lift by a long shot because it was always like the earlier the bar gets back, the better. I don't know if that's true.
Well, when I was thinking of heavyweight technical benchers, the most obvious one is Mendelsohn, who was a multiply lifter. He was in that big race with Kennelly back in the day. He's doing something still. He's old, and he's putting on the band shirts now, this new generation of nonsense. But I remember I've watched when he had the record at 7:15 or so. I've watched that video 100 times, and I've watched his tutorials on how he cues everything, and it is... it reminds me of what you used to say about if you're benching and you're comfortable, you're not benching well. Benching is very uncomfortable. But I molded myself for a few years when I was younger into that setup. and it is extremely uncomfortable, extremely limited, and extremely compact. And it's something that you almost never see anywhere else. I think the only other person that gets close is Brian Siders, and I don't even know that he was as exaggerated as Mendelsohn was. A good analysis I heard is like, I mean, God, just the stress on like your shoulders, like your AC joint coming down that low, like trying to Kyriakos like front lever that bench back. But
yeah,
it also
I'm a big. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna follow it up with it calls back to what you were talking about, explosive benchers, guys who can't grind, because that's another thing. I don't know if it's a point of controversy. I guess it's chicken or the egg, but for every bit of West Side, Louis wisdom that it's like, the faster you go, the more likely you are to clear it out. It's like, yeah, but also if you have no endurance, you don't have the ability to grind. And I see that J curve. It's almost like a really clean ramp on a deadlift, where every inch the bar comes up, you should be mechanically stronger, so that when you do get pinned, you actually have a bit of purchase where you can increase your leverages and execute a clean lockout. Where if you are just 400-pound Julius Maddox or 450, the speed and power, it doesn't matter because 750 is coming up off the chest.
Yeah, you get some interesting arguments there. I think you can mask poor positions through speed, and I think that including slower work to make sure that you're positionally sound. Like I do a lot of pause work on my deadlift, even though I'm a relatively fast deadlifter. It's because lightweights aren't going to give me that feedback if I'm at a bad position off the floor, if I'm at a bad position passing the knee. So I use that as a kind of a positional audit on the way up. So I definitely think that, and there's like a heuristic that guys who naturally lift really slow might actually might benefit from more compensatory acceleration work. And guys that naturally lift fast probably would not benefit from that much at all and would benefit more from slower, more positional work because it kind of fills in what they're missing. But I've never viewed the inability to grind as this big problem. I think a lot of that's just a genetic predisposition, and that's a technical model. Everybody's going to miss somewhere, right? The slow guy missed because he wasn't fast, and the fast guy missed because he couldn't grind. And it's like, as long as our competitive result is rising, I don't view either of those as bad. It's just like, and if it stops working, maybe you need to look at becoming slightly more like the other guy. But it's like, everybody's gonna have a sticking point somewhere, right? Like it's not, we don't need to demonize. You're gonna miss somewhere. Like you can't just pick up infinite weight. So whether you're a little bit on that faster end of the velocity curve or on the slower end of the velocity curve, but like what you were talking about, right? I'm a big believer that the lower the touch point, right, the more horizontal travel we have. That's a lot of the role of the shoulder in the bench press is the horizontal component. And I, again, talk about like technical ceilings and how overhead with it's a leg dominant, I think is a higher ceiling. I urge my athletes towards more of a pec dominant bench. I actually, as long as they can control the positions, I like that higher touch point. I like having less horizontal travel. I think guys get away with shoulder dominant benches with huge horizontal, like Kaz-esque, like it's moving a foot back and forth. But I think for most athletes, from what I've seen, the more work we can do with the chest and the triceps, the better. Like look at someone like John Hack. Can't strict press 3 plates, is a 600-pound bencher. Why? Because he's biased. Look at his fucking chest versus look at his shoulders, right? Part of that's predisposition. The guy with the big chest is the better bencher. But I think the more we can bias, more work being done with the pecs, that's slightly higher touch point, a lot of work, the lockout being predominantly done with the triceps, versus you see guys drop that AC joint, like their chest falls. Like that's what most shoulder dominant is, like here where we cave, our chest falls down. We're not actually opening the pec fibers very much. We heave and we finish it with our shoulders. Can work. And that's kind of why, like you mentioned, like, oh, strongman, they do a bunch of overhead and then they can bench. And I think they can bench, but they would have a hard time developing that long term because they all do this very shoulder dominant pattern, closer grip, low touch, hoop, huge. Like a lot of it's just like this, like you said, Kyriakos style this. And I think that's why a lot of guys also tear their pec, because they actually have not trained opening the pec fibers to a higher touch point at all, right? If you look at Thor's bench, it was like that. I was always worried about that. It's like he's benching with his shoulders, his pecs never really open, and of course they're not really adapted to that more stretched position.
Yeah, whereas Tom Borello, I hope I said his name right, is, I'm sure he's trampolined bars off his chest since he was a wee lad, and I can only imagine the absolute thickness of those tendons that attach to his humerus, because it's still nauseating. So let's put a bow on this. Let's bring it full circle because it's been a big overhead theme. We just talked about benching. Now the last thing I want to know, going back to your overhead prep. So you're this huge bencher. Now you're chasing this 400-pound press, assuming you're going to pick it back up after this next meet you have lined up. So how did you balance benching in pursuit of this particular goal? To what degree did you put it on the back burner, or did you even eliminate it altogether?
I've been doing one set a week just because the one set's honestly because I like it. Realistically, right, I get my chest stronger is not going to do jack shit to get my overhead up. And I believe my triceps are already plenty strong, right? So we talk about like opportunity costs. The training I put towards my bench press is pressing recovery that could be spent towards something that's a lot more relevant to my weaknesses. It's the shoulder musculature. My upper back's pretty strong. My mobility's fine. My midsection is plenty strong. It's shoulder musculature that's the difference between me and the me with a 405 press. I don't really see a reason to direct a lot of training economy towards the chest in general. If I was like especially if I was doing the jerks or something, I think that you sign yourself, especially like, this is something me and Alec, honestly, he came around to my point, and just like at the end of the day, he's like, it's not what I do. I don't look at the development of like novice athletes. He's in the business of taking people who are already really good and getting them better. And at that point in career, bench pressing he views as very not valuable for becoming the best overhead athlete you could be. And I would always make and like even strict pressing, he doesn't rate super highly. And I was making the argument like, okay, but yeah, it's a pretty, you're a big sports science guy. Across the career, specificity will rise. But that means early career, we're looking for more general qualities. And I would argue in that early career, becoming a bigger, more muscular person, like we said, you're so far from your pecs being so big it fucks up your overhead position. Just getting bigger, stronger pressing muscles is really good. So I always like, people are like, oh, Sam, you stopped benching because it was getting in the way of when I was push pressing for this show. And I was like, don't do that. I've already benched 600. I bench more. I don't know if I'm missing anybody. I bench more than every world's competitor. That's not a flex because they're not dumb and they're not wasting their time on it like I am, right? Everybody was benching in preparation for the Shaw too. Like we saw them test it. And like top guys were getting about 550, which is insane how quickly they got to 550, but it's not 600. I already have that. I don't need that. And if anything, I'm also at the level of pec development. Like you said, big old tendons. I'm at the level of pec development that I need them to atrophy a little bit. I need to have better access to these true overhead positions. So for me, even for the strict press, I was running a close grip incline for a while, and I was actually pushing those hard because I definitely feel, again, I do more horizontal travel. It felt like I was getting a lot of delt and tricep out of it, and I'm like, well, I need delt and tricep. I don't need chest right now. And that was kind of how I worked my way through it, was the benching kind of fell off a cliff.
That advice was advice I took. I was that guy that heard that from a pro level strongman. I'd sat in at a seminar at the LA Fit Expo back in 2006, and it was like Ode Haugen when he was still in Worlds, a couple small guys, and then Jesse Morunde. And there were probably 15 nerds in there at the time because strongman wasn't big. And I remember Jesse Morunde specifically saying, you have this football player / Olympic lifter from Washington, who now is a world's strongest man competitor. And he's like, yeah, I never bench press, bro. You don't need it. It's not specific. And I took that to heart, and I stopped benching for like 2 or 3 years. And my overhead got insane because I was just doing push jerks and push presses, strict presses. And then I found myself without any physical ability to grab a stone. I would bomb. I couldn't pick a 250 sandbag. I'd hit like a 365 overhead press, and I couldn't pick a 250 sandbag because I just didn't have any crushing power, and I have short arms on top of that. And I remember that was one of the worst things I ever did. And it just speaks to like, yeah, there's an element of general development that you need where you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater because your goal is not to be the most specialized athlete you can be right now, because that's not a real thing. It's like when you're novice, and even when you're in your intermediate working up, it's like you're increasing in specificity, but if you don't get that backdrop, that base behind you, it's never going to happen anyways. You're going to shoot yourself in the foot trying to force it.
When you see a lot of, sorry, I thought something.
No,
I just think you'll think this is interesting, right? You can see in top level strongman the inclusion of some weird stuff to try to stave off those maladaptations of the more specific training, right? Like you'll see StrongerMan's guys are constantly doing like protraction push-ups or offset hand position push-ups because what have they lost? They have lost protraction ability because they've been so focused on pulling and pushing stuff overhead and never pushing into horizontal plane that's a function that they've lost. So it's a positive adaptation for picking all this stuff up and putting stuff over your head, but eventually you get these maladaptations because that adaptation was taken so far, right? Same thing with like bench pressing. You bench press enough, you start losing the ability to put your arms over your head because that built-in bench shirt was a positive adaptation, but eventually you take it so far, we start losing human functions as maladaptations, and then you need to include these weird exercises to stave off maladaptation. That's why I'm obsessed with the behind the neck presses, because when you're doing all this big pushing and pulling to get stronger, as you and I know, like you and I preach on our channels, just fucking do the pulling and pushing. Get stronger at pulling and pushing, right? Pec and lat are internal rotators of the shoulder. All of these guys at Worlds have been doing their pulling and pushing for 10 years now, and they've lost access to external rotation. So just the inclusion of a behind the neck somewhere in the program, it doubles as both getting in some pressing volume, awesome, but it preserves and staves off that maladaptation you get from all of the specific work. Same thing with like the goofy offset push-ups, like really protraction heavy work. It staves off and preserves a function that the specific work would gradually chip away at when you're at these levels of big and strong. But then you get guys who are small and new who are worried about like, well, I heard if you do all this, you'll lose ER. And it's like, first of all, your training should be so general and be preserved without special exercise. And second of all, you're so far from your level of muscularity being large enough to inhibit these movements. Just train through full ranges is enough. You don't need directed mobility, and you don't need these correctional exercises yet.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Sam, I could talk with you all day, but it's Saturday, and I'm pretty sure I have a family I'm supposed to be spending time with. I don't know what they're doing out there. But why don't you go ahead and let everybody know where they can find you, and then let us know the date and location of the contest you have coming up.
So I don't know the date and location because I didn't read it. I was running around the house being like, oh, international, I get to compete against Kevin Ferris, and I forgot to read where it was.
SPR Federation and NWO Federation. Okay.
Be careful. I'm going to stick Bobby Thompson on you.
PSL. Tell him I say hi when you see him.
So YouTube, Shether Training. Instagram, Shether, Shetthar. My little brother's Instagram, who's very strong and cool and has a nice mustache. _1_rep_max. The 1 rep max. He's pretty easy to find. That's basically all I got going on. If you guys want to follow me.
And I recommend that you guys do because, like I said, you get insight into his training, you get his full training vlog, and there's just a ton of insight into the methods that go into building all of this madness. So, Sam, thank you so much for joining us today. We're obviously going to do this again very soon. Thank you so much, guys, for watching. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.